Hello and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. On the 15th of August, in the year 1769, in a tall, narrow stone house on a steep street in the town of Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica, a young woman named Letizia Bonaparte, 23 years old, and 8 months pregnant with her 4th child, was sitting in church, listening to the Feast of the Assumption being sung, when the pains came upon her too quickly and too hard to wait for the walk home to be a comfortable one. She left the pew and hurried up the hill through the narrow streets, past the neighbours who would tell the story for the rest of their lives, and reached her own house only just in time, and there, so the family legend insists, with no proper bed made ready, she lay down upon an old sofa in a downstairs room, whose covering was woven with the design of the heroes of ancient mythology, Achilles and Hector, and the rest of the warriors of the Iliad, marching across the fabric beneath her, and upon that sofa, before the midwife could so much as be sent for, she gave birth to a small, thin, sickly-looking boy, whom she and her husband would name Napoleone. Whether the story of the sofa and its heroes is entirely true, or whether it was one of those details that families polish into shape after the fact, once a name is famous enough to deserve an omen, we cannot say for certain, and it is worth setting that uncertainty down gently at the very start of this long night, because uncertainty of exactly this kind will follow this story everywhere it goes, all the way to its ending. But what is not in doubt, what the parish register in Ajaccio still plainly shows, is the date and the place and the family. A lawyer of modest means named Carlo Buonaparte, descended from minor Italian nobility so far reduced in fortune that the word noble meant in practice almost nothing at all beyond a claim on paper. A large, proud, quarrelsome and chronically indebted household on an island that had belonged to the Republic of Genoa for centuries and had only just, the year before this birth, been sold to the Kingdom of France against the will of most of the Corsicans who lived there, and a boy who would grow up speaking Corsican and Italian before he ever learned to speak French properly, who would be teased for the rest of his school days for his accent and his poverty and his strange foreign name, and who would, within a little more than 20 years of leaving that island as an obscure and penniless cadet, make himself the master of more of Europe than any single man had ruled since the fall of Rome. Let that sit with you for a moment, because it is the whole strangeness of this story, compressed into a single sentence, and this whole long night will be spent unpacking it. Somewhere in the world tonight, a child is being born in a small house on a hillside, in a family with more pride than money, in a country that does not entirely think of itself as belonging where it has been placed, and by every reasonable measure that child's life will be an ordinary one, bounded by the town he was born in and the modest profession that awaits him. That was, by every sober calculation available to anyone living in Ajaccio in the year 1769, exactly what awaited Napoleon Bonaparte. A career, if he was fortunate, as a minor officer or a provincial lawyer, a life spent at best on the edges of the great events of his age, reading about the doings of kings and ministers in newspapers that reached his island weeks late. Instead, within a single generation, this boy would overturn the map of an entire continent. He would abolish kingdoms that had stood for centuries and invent new ones overnight. He would put his own brothers and sisters, most of whom had grown up nearly as poor as he had, on the thrones of Naples and Holland and Westphalia and Spain. He would humble the House of Habsburg, which had ruled Central Europe since the Middle Ages, and force the King of Prussia to beg for his kingdom's survival, and march an army of 600,000 men into the heart of Russia, and stand, for a little more than a decade, as very nearly the sole author of the fate of hundreds of millions of people who had never chosen him, and, in most cases, never wanted him. And then, just as suddenly, just as improbably, he would lose all of it, piece by piece, in snow and mud and blood, and end his days confined to a damp, wind-battered rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, thousands of miles from the sofa he had been born on, dictating his own legend to whoever would still listen. How did that happen? That is the question this whole night is built to answer, slowly, patiently, the way these questions deserve to be answered, without the easy shortcuts that the word genius offers, because genius, on its own, explains nothing. Genius is a label we paste over things we have not yet bothered to understand. The true answer, as it so often is in these long stories we tell in the dark, is not one thing but many things arriving together. A revolution that tore up the old rules of European society and in doing so opened a path upward for a talented outsider that had simply not existed one generation before. An army reorganised by the men of that revolution into something faster and hungrier and more ruthlessly meritocratic than any army Europe had fielded in centuries. A continent of old monarchies that underestimated, again and again, the seriousness of the threat gathering against them, because they could not quite bring themselves to believe that history could be made by a Corsican artillery officer rather than by one of themselves. And, running beneath all of it, a single human being of extraordinary ambition, extraordinary organisational capacity, extraordinary personal courage, and an almost total absence of the ordinary human hesitations that might have made him pause before spending other men's lives, in their tens of thousands, to satisfy his own restless, unappeasable sense of what he was owed by history. Napoleon Bonaparte did not conquer Europe in a single campaign, and he did not conquer it alone, and he did not conquer all of it. Not quite, not ever completely. What he did was assemble an empire the way these things are always actually assembled, which is to say, messily, opportunistically, one war at a time, one treaty at a time, one victory that opened the door to the next war, across nearly a quarter of a century of almost uninterrupted fighting, until the France he had inherited as a small, isolated revolutionary republic, surrounded by enemies and nearly bankrupt, had become the dominant power of an entire continent, ruled by his family and garrisoned by his soldiers from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the gates of Moscow. And then, in a final chapter as swift and as merciless as the rise had been, he lost every bit of it. Before we drift into the rest of this long story together, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, because that is the only reason I would ever want you to. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments below. It is a small thing, but it helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the internet, and there is something quietly comforting about knowing that somewhere out there, in a different time zone, under a different sky, a stranger is settling into their own bed tonight, listening to this same slow unspooling of history. So get comfortable now, let your shoulders drop, let your eyes soften, even if they stay open a while longer yet. Turn the light down if you can, and let yourself sink into the long tale of how a poor, foreign-accented boy from a small island became the master of Europe, and how, in the end, the very continent he had conquered rose up, and very slowly, very painfully, took it all back, a conscript son of a minor nobleman. To understand how this happened, we cannot begin with the wars. We have to begin, as these stories so often insist on beginning, with the world as it stood just before everything changed, because Napoleon Bonaparte was not a meteor that fell out of a clear sky. He was a product, an almost inevitable product, of a very particular and very unstable moment in European history, and it is worth spending some patient time in that moment before we watch it come apart. The France into which the 9-year-old Napoleon was sent in the year 1778 to begin his formal education was still, on its surface, the grandest and most admired kingdom in Europe, the France of Versailles, and its endless gilded corridors of a court so elaborate that a nobleman might spend his entire adult life mastering nothing but its etiquette, of an army considered among the finest on the continent, and a culture, in language and philosophy and fashion, that the rest of Europe imitated as a matter of course. But beneath that gleaming surface the kingdom was rotting in ways that its own rulers understood only dimly and addressed hardly at all. Its finances were a catastrophe of long standing, strained past their limits by decades of expensive wars, including, ironically enough, a war fought to help 13 rebellious colonies across the Atlantic Ocean win their independence from the British Crown, a war that cost the French treasury more than it could ever hope to recover, and that exposed to every literate Frenchman who cared to notice the electrifying idea that a people might indeed throw off a king and govern themselves. Its social structure was built upon a system of privilege so rigid and so ancient that a man's rights, his taxes, even the courts he could be tried in, depended almost entirely on which of 3 legally defined estates he had happened to be born into: the clergy, the nobility, or everyone else, a vast category called the Third Estate that included both the poorest peasant scraping at exhausted soil and the wealthiest merchant in Paris, both of them locked out by an accident of birth from the privileges that a threadbare provincial nobleman enjoyed simply because his family had once, centuries before, been granted a title. And it was into the lower, poorer, provincial edge of that nobility, a rank so modest that some historians have doubted it was genuine nobility at all, that young Napoleon Bonaparte had been born on an island the French crown itself had only just acquired, among a people who did not entirely think of themselves as French, and were not, in turn, entirely trusted by the French. His father, Carlo, had made his own peace with the new French rulers of Corsica, with a speed that some of his neighbours never forgave, abandoning the cause of Corsican independence, which he had once served under the great island patriot Pasquale Paoli, in exchange for the official recognition of the Bonaparte family's noble status, a recognition that, once obtained, opened a narrow but real door. It made his sons eligible for free, subsidised education at royal military academies on the mainland, an education that a family as poor as the Bonaparte could never otherwise have afforded, and it is worth pausing on that door for a moment, because it is one of the small hinges upon which this entire enormous story turns. Without his father's calculated accommodation with French power, without that scrap of aristocratic paperwork, there is no obvious path by which the son of an impoverished Corsican family reaches, at the age of 9, the shores of France at all, let alone the classrooms of a royal military school. He arrived that year at a preparatory school in autumn, barely able to speak French, and was sent on soon after to the military academy at Brienne, in the northeast of the country, where he spent 5 years among the sons of France's established nobility. Boys who mocked his accent, his island manners, his obvious poverty, and not least, his name, which they twisted into a taunting pun on the French word for straw, paille, calling him la paille au nez. He was, by every account that survives from those years, an unhappy, prickly, fiercely proud boy, quick to anger, slow to make friends, who threw himself instead into reading, devouring history and geography, and above all mathematics, at which he showed a genuine and unusual talent. The kind of talent that the 18th century's armies, increasingly dependent on the precise geometry of artillery fire, had begun to prize very highly indeed. It is worth dwelling for just a moment on what those 5 lonely years at Brienne actually built inside him, because the historians who came after him would spend 2 centuries arguing over whether Napoleon Bonaparte was made by circumstance or born a kind of natural conqueror, and the honest answer, as it nearly always is, sits somewhere between the 2 extremes. A boy of real, undeniable intellectual gifts, sharpened against real, undeniable early humiliation, developing in isolation a fierce private conviction that he was owed by the world a great deal more respect than the world around him was currently prepared to grant, a conviction that would never really leave him again for the rest of his life. From Brienne he went on at 15 to the elite military academy in Paris itself, and there too he felt the sting of the mainland French nobility's easy, unthinking contempt for provincial poverty, watching wealthier cadets spend money he did not have and receive attentions he was not offered. And it was there, too, in the year 1785, that his father died of stomach cancer, leaving the family's already precarious finances in worse disorder still and thrusting onto the shoulders of the 16-year-old Napoleone, as the eldest son present and capable, a responsibility for his mother and his younger brothers and sisters that would shape his sense of duty and his impatience with sentiment for the rest of his days. He graduated that same year, an unusually young age for a commission, ranked 42nd out of 58 candidates in his class, a middling result that owed less to any lack of ability than to the sheer speed of his studies, having compressed a course of instruction that normally took 2 or 3 years into a single one, driven, it seems, by financial necessity as much as by ambition. And he was commissioned as a second lieutenant of artillery, the branch of the army in which technical skill mattered more and inherited noble privilege slightly less than in the glittering cavalry regiments that the wealthiest young aristocrats preferred. For the next several years, the young Lieutenant Bonaparte, as he was now known, served in garrison towns across provincial France, reading voraciously in his off hours, filling notebooks with historical and philosophical extracts, and with his own restless, often derivative political musings, applying for leave to return to Corsica with a frequency that alarmed his superiors, and generally giving very little outward sign to anyone who knew him during those years that he was destined for anything more remarkable than a solid, unspectacular career as a competent artillery officer in a kingdom that, in any case, seemed to be entering its final, exhausted years. And then, in the summer of 1789, the kingdom broke open. The financial crisis that had been building for a generation finally forced King Louis XVI to summon a body called the Estates General, an ancient consultative assembly that had not met in over a century and a half, in the hope that its members might agree to new taxes. Instead, the representatives of the Third Estate, joined by sympathetic clergy and nobles, declared themselves the legitimate National Assembly of France, swore an oath not to disperse until they had given the nation a new constitution, and within weeks watched the whole rigid, ancient structure of French society begin to come apart at a speed that stunned observers across the entire continent. On the 14th of July, a Parisian crowd, fearing the king meant to crush the new assembly by force, stormed the old royal fortress and prison known as the Bastille, and though the building held only a handful of prisoners at the time, its fall became, almost immediately, the great symbolic image of a people's rebellion against arbitrary royal power, celebrated then and celebrated still. In August, the assembly abolished in a single astonishing nighttime session the entire structure of feudal privilege that had organised French society for centuries, and adopted a declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen that proclaimed, in language that shook every royal court in Europe, that men were born and remained free and equal in rights. Within 3 years the monarchy itself would fall, the king would be tried and executed on a public scaffold, and France would be declared a republic, at war, almost immediately, with a coalition of the great monarchies of Europe, Austria and Prussia, and soon Britain and Spain, and half a dozen others besides, all of them alarmed, for reasons both principled and self-interested, at the sight of a great kingdom overthrowing its own crown, and all of them determined, in the beginning at least, to put the old order back. It is worth pausing here gently to notice something that will matter enormously for the rest of this story, which is what the revolution did, almost as a side effect of its own political upheaval, to the French army, because it is impossible to understand the wars that follow without understanding this one particular consequence first. In the old royal army, the officer corps had been, with only the rarest exceptions, the exclusive property of the nobility. A commoner of talent, however brilliant, could rise only so far, and the highest ranks were reserved, almost as a matter of settled law, for men whose families could produce the right documents. The revolution shattered that arrangement completely. As thousands of noble officers fled the country in the years after 1789, unwilling to serve a revolutionary government or fearing, with good reason for their lives, The new republic found itself desperately short of experienced commanders at precisely the moment it needed, more than it had ever needed before, to raise vast citizen armies to defend its borders against the combined monarchies of Europe. It filled the gap with talent wherever it could find it, promoting sergeants to generals within a matter of months if they showed sufficient competence and sufficient revolutionary loyalty, creating, almost overnight, the single most rapid system of merit-based advancement that any European army had ever seen. And it is here, in this precise historical crack, this narrow window thrown open by chaos and necessity, that the poor, provincial, foreign-accented, mathematically gifted young Lieutenant Bonaparte found the opportunity that the old order would almost certainly have denied him for the whole of his working life. He did not make the revolution. He was, in his own writings from those early years, ambivalent about much of it, more interested for a long while in the fate of his native Corsica than in the politics of Paris, and he came within a hair's breadth in the chaos of Corsican factional politics in 1793, of ending his career as an obscure exile rather than a French general, quarrelling so badly with his old idol Pasquale Paoli, now leading Corsica toward alignment with Britain rather than revolutionary France, that the entire Bonaparte family was forced to flee the island for good, arriving on the French mainland that summer as penniless refugees. But the door the revolution had opened stayed open, and in the autumn of that same catastrophic year, an opportunity arrived that would carry the 24-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte out of obscurity for good. A gunner at Toulon, the great port city of Toulon on the Mediterranean coast, home to a large part of the French navy, had risen in revolt against the revolutionary government in Paris that summer, and in a move that turned a domestic uprising into a matter of urgent national emergency, its royalist leadership had invited in British and Spanish warships to occupy the harbour and hold the city against the Republic. A French Republican army was sent to besiege the city and take it back, and it was there, almost by accident, that the young Bonaparte arrived in September of 1793, filling in for a wounded artillery commander, and found himself for the first time in his career in a position where his genuine technical mastery of artillery could be applied at scale against a real target under conditions of real urgency. He surveyed the harbour with a mathematician's eye and proposed a plan that the besieging army's senior commanders had not considered. Rather than attempting to storm the heavily fortified city itself, mass the guns instead on the high ground overlooking the harbour mouth, and use them to make the anchorage itself untenable for the British and Spanish fleets, forcing the ships, and with them the will to hold the city, to withdraw. It took weeks of grinding, dangerous work, dragging heavy guns up muddy hillsides under fire, enduring a wound from a British bayonet in the thigh that would trouble him for years afterward, and overcoming the scepticism of more senior officers who did not care for the confidence of this small, thin, intense young captain with the strange accent. But the plan worked. In December, the guns opened a devastating fire on the anchored Allied fleet. The British commander concluded the harbour could no longer be held, and the occupying forces evacuated the city in a chaotic, burning retreat, taking with them thousands of terrified royalist civilians who feared, correctly, what awaited them if they stayed. Toulon fell to the Republic, and the political commissioners overseeing the siege, recognising that they had witnessed something unusual, recommended the young officer for promotion. At 24 years old, Napoleon Bonaparte was made a brigadier general. It is worth dwelling, just for a moment, on how strange and how fast that really was, because we will need to remember, later in this story, just how accustomed Napoleon became to the idea that ability, applied with sufficient force and sufficient confidence, should be rewarded instantly and completely, an assumption forged in these earliest years and never afterward corrected by the ordinary friction of a slower career. It is worth remembering, too, that this triumph very nearly ended in disaster only months later, when the political faction that had promoted him, the radical Jacobins led by Maximilien Robespierre, fell from power in the summer of 1794 in the violent internal reckoning that ended the revolution's most blood-stained phase. the period we now call the Terror, and the young general, tainted by association with the fallen faction, and with Robespierre's brother in particular, whom he had befriended, was arrested and briefly imprisoned. His career, only months after its spectacular beginning, hanging by the thinnest of threads. He was released after a matter of weeks for lack of real evidence against him, but the following year brought further indignity. Reassigned to infantry command in the west of France, a posting he considered beneath his talents, he refused it, was struck from the army's active list altogether, and spent the autumn of 1795 unemployed in Paris, his prospects, by any ordinary measure, considerably worse than they had been 2 years before at Toulon. It is one of the quiet ironies that this whole story keeps circling back to, that a career built so largely on speed and audacity nearly ended more than once in the most ordinary of ways through bureaucratic obscurity and political bad luck, and that what saved it, on this occasion as on several others still to come, was less some inevitable unfolding of destiny than a specific, contingent, almost accidental emergency that happened to require exactly the skills this one particular unemployed general possessed. Whiff of grape shot. The emergency arrived that October in the form of a royalist uprising in the streets of Paris itself, a rising of disaffected sections of the city, resentful of the new, more moderate revolutionary government known as the Directory, that threatened, with several thousand armed insurgents converging on the seat of government, to overthrow the Republic by force in the very capital where it had been born. The Directory's leading figures, casting about in some desperation for a commander willing and able to defend them, remembered the young artillery officer from Toulon, and gave him command of the government's small and badly outnumbered defending force. Bonaparte's response was, in miniature, a preview of nearly everything that would define his military career for the following 2 decades: speed, ruthlessness, and a complete willingness to apply overwhelming, concentrated firepower against an enemy that still, in some old-fashioned part of its collective mind, expected the rules of 18th century warfare to be observed. He sent a young cavalry officer named Joachim Murat, a name we will meet again many times in this story, galloping across the city before dawn to seize a supply of artillery pieces before the insurgents could reach them, positioned his guns to command the narrow streets approaching the government buildings, and, when the royalist crowds advanced that afternoon, ordered his gunners to fire directly into the packed columns with grape shot, a murderous charge of small iron balls designed to shred a mass of infantry at close range. Several hundred insurgents were killed or wounded within minutes. The rising, which had threatened the survival of the Republic itself only hours before, collapsed almost immediately. Bonaparte himself would later describe the action, with characteristic, chilling understatement, as a mere whiff of grape shot, a phrase that has echoed down through 2 centuries of history books, and the Directory, grateful and more than a little unnerved by the ruthless efficiency of the man who had just saved them, promoted him again, this time to command of the Republic's entire army of the interior, and, not long afterward, to a far more consequential post still, command of the Army of Italy, one of the Republic's several field armies still engaged in the ongoing war against the coalition of European monarchies, determined to crush the revolution and restore the old order. It was in the months surrounding this appointment too that the personal life of Napoleon Bonaparte took a turn that would matter, in ways large and small for the rest of his story. Through the fashionable salons of post-terror Paris, where a generation traumatized by the guillotine had thrown itself into a kind of feverish, relieved pleasure-seeking, he met a widow 6 years his senior named Josephine de Beauharnais, whose first husband had been executed during the Terror, and who moved through Parisian society with a worldly grace and a sexual confidence that the awkward, intense young general, still very much the provincial outsider in matters of romance and society, found utterly intoxicating. Their courtship was brief, and their marriage, in March of 1796, was, by the standards of the arranged and dynastic unions that would later define so much of Napoleon's family diplomacy, an unusually passionate and personally chosen one, though it is worth noting gently, in the spirit of honesty this whole channel tries to hold too, that Josephine's own feelings in those early months seem to have been considerably cooler and more calculating than her new husband's, and that the marriage would, across the following years, bring both of them real happiness and real, sometimes devastating heartbreak in roughly equal measure. Within days of the wedding, Bonaparte left Paris and his new bride behind and rode south to Nice to take up command of the army of Italy, an army that its previous commanders and the Directory and Paris alike regarded as something of a backwater posting, a ragged, ill-supplied, unpaid force of some 40,000 men, considered far less important than the armies facing Austria and Prussia along the Rhine, given to a young general still viewed by many of his own subordinates, several of them older and more experienced than he was, with open scepticism. He was 26 years old. Within a year, he would make that scepticism look, in retrospect, almost unimaginably foolish. The Italian campaign. When Bonaparte arrived at his new army's headquarters near Nice in the spring of 1796, he found a force that looked, on paper and in the flesh alike, very little like the instrument of conquest it was about to become. The men were owed months of back pay. Many lacked proper boots or coats, or even, in some units, functioning muskets. Morale had settled into the low, sullen grumbling of soldiers who have stopped expecting anything from the men who command them. The senior officers of the army, several of them veterans who had commanded troops in the field, while their new general was still a schoolboy at Brienne, regarded this slight, intense young Corsican, who owed his rank as much to political connections and a lucky season as to battlefield seniority, with an open and barely concealed condescension. Bonaparte's response in the first days of his command was to do what he would do again and again across the following 20 years whenever he took hold of an army. He imposed, through sheer force of personality and an unnerving command of logistical and tactical detail, an immediate and total authority. He reviewed the troops in person, spoke to them directly in the plain, vivid, almost theatrical language that would become his lifelong signature as a communicator of morale, promising them, in an order of the day that has been quoted in history books ever since, that he would lead them into the richest plains in the world, where honour and glory and wealth all awaited them. And he meant, quite literally, wealth, because the campaign that followed would be paid for, in large part, by stripping the Italian states his army conquered of their treasuries, their art and their food stores, a practice that fed his soldiers and financed his war, and, not incidentally, began the process by which the Louvre in Paris would fill with paintings and sculptures taken by force from Italian churches and palaces and princely collections. What followed, across the spring and summer of 1796, was a campaign that stunned professional soldiers across Europe and made the name Bonaparte for the first time, a name that ordinary people outside France had heard and had reason to fear. Facing him were the armies of the Kingdom of Sardinia, Piedmont, and of Austria, the two powers that between them dominated northern Italy, commanded by generals trained in the careful, methodical, geometrically minded warfare of the 18th century. An approach to war that prized the capture of fortified towns and the maintenance of secure supply lines above all else, and that assumed, reasonably enough by the standards of its own age, that an army could not move faster than its own bread wagons. Bonaparte discarded that assumption almost entirely. He drove his ill-supplied troops to live off the country they marched through, foraging and requisitioning as they went, which let them move at a pace their enemies could not match and could not anticipate. He concentrated his forces with mathematical precision at the exact point of contact, again and again catching divided enemy armies before they could unite, defeating the Piedmontese in a rapid sequence of engagements that knocked the kingdom out of the war within 2 weeks of the campaign's opening, and then turning immediately on the Austrians before they had fully grasped that their allies were already beaten. At the Bridge of Lodi in May, in an action that became almost instantly the stuff of legend within his own army, he personally directed and, by several accounts, helped lead a desperate infantry assault across a narrow, heavily defended bridge under withering Austrian cannon fire, an act of physical bravery that, true in its essentials whatever embellishments were added later, earned him from his own grizzled veterans the affectionate nickname Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal, a name that would follow him with real fondness for the rest of his life. Milan fell to him that same month, and the Italian campaign, which the Directory in Paris had originally conceived as a secondary theatre, meant merely to distract Austrian attention from the main event unfolding along the Rhine, had, within a matter of weeks, become the most consequential and most closely watched campaign in the entire war. It is worth pausing here to notice what was actually new in what Bonaparte was doing, because the temptation, looking backward from 2 centuries' distance, is to credit it all to some innate and unanalysable genius. And that temptation, however flattering to the myth, obscures something more useful and more true. What Bonaparte brought to Italy was not a set of tactics nobody had ever seen before. The ideas of rapid concentration of force, of living off the land, of aggressive pursuit after victory, had all been discussed, in theory, by French military thinkers in the decades before the Revolution, and some had even been tried, in fragments, by other revolutionary generals along other fronts. What Bonaparte brought was the willingness and the sheer organisational nerve to apply all of these ideas at once ruthlessly, without the caution that more conventional commanders instinctively reserved for the moment, when a plan might fail catastrophically rather than succeed spectacularly, combined with a personal energy that let him be everywhere at once, drafting orders through the night, riding to the front line to assess ground with his own eyes, absorbing and processing more information faster than the staffs of his opponents could manage. He also possessed, and this deserves to be said plainly, an unusual gift for propaganda and self-presentation that ran alongside his gift for war. He had his own printing presses follow the army into Italy, publishing bulletins that reported his victories to the French public in language carefully calibrated to build his personal legend, often exaggerating enemy losses and minimising his own, so that the France that read about the Italian campaign in its newspapers that year was reading in effect an early and highly effective work of political myth-making, written and edited by its own subject. Across the following year, Bonaparte drove deeper into Austrian territory than any French commander had managed in the entire war, defeating a succession of Austrian armies and their generals, several of them older and more experienced men sent by Vienna specifically to put an end to this upstart's run of luck, at Castiglione, at Arcole, where he was very nearly killed or captured in the marshes along the river, and at Rivoli in January of 1797, a battle so cleanly and completely won that it entered the training curricula of European military academies for the following century as a model of the concentrated, decisive battle he had made his signature. By the spring of 1797, his army stood within a few days' march of Vienna itself, and the Austrian court, its main field armies broken and its capital undefended, sued for peace. And here, in the negotiations that followed, we see another pattern that would recur throughout Napoleon's career, and that deserves honest notice rather than quiet omission. Acting almost entirely on his own authority, with only the loosest of instructions from a directory in Paris that was, in truth, a little afraid of him, and a little dazzled by him in equal measure, the young general redrew the map of Italy and Central Europe to suit himself, dissolving the ancient Republic of Venice, a state that had governed itself for over 1,000 years, and handing its mainland territories to Austria as a sweetener to secure the broader peace, in exchange for Austrian recognition of new French client republics carved out of the rest of northern Italy. It was, by any honest reckoning, a piece of old-fashioned, cynical great power horse trading, dressed up in the language of revolutionary liberation, and the Venetians, who had believed the French army's early promises of freedom from their own ageing oligarchy, discovered instead that they had simply been traded to a new master. It is worth sitting with that discomfort for a moment, because it will not be the last time in this story that the language of liberty and the reality of conquest sit uneasily side by side, and a channel that tells this story honestly owes you the discomfort along with the glory. He returned to Paris in the winter of 1797, not as a general returning from one campaign among many, but as something closer to a public phenomenon, mobbed by crowds, celebrated in the newspapers his own presses had helped shape, received by a directory that greeted him with elaborate public ceremony, even as its individual members, privately, watched his growing popularity with real and justified unease. A general who could win wars almost entirely on his own initiative, who negotiated treaties without waiting for his government's approval, and who commanded the near-total devotion of the soldiers under him, was not, whatever the directory's public praise suggested, an entirely comfortable asset for a republic to possess. It is against this backdrop of mutual unspoken wariness between the general and his own government that Bonaparte's next great venture needs to be understood, because the invasion of Egypt that followed in the summer of 1798 was, on the surface, a bold strategic stroke aimed at Britain's trade routes to India, but underneath that stated purpose, it was also quite plainly a convenient way for a nervous directory to send its most dangerously popular general very far away, and a convenient way for that general, restless, already in the confines of civilian Paris, and drawn by genuine intellectual curiosity as much as by ambition toward the romance of the ancient East, to seek a new and even grander stage, the Eagle in Egypt, the expedition that sailed from Toulon in May of 1798. Nearly 40,000 soldiers packed aboard a fleet that also carried, in a detail that tells you a great deal about the peculiar mind of the man who assembled it, over 150 scholars, scientists, artists, and engineers, savants whom Bonaparte had specifically recruited to study and catalogue the antiquities and natural history of a land that had gripped the European imagination for centuries, was, in nearly every strategic respect, a gamble bordering on recklessness. It sailed past a British fleet under a young admiral named Horatio Nelson, a name we will meet again very soon and under much darker circumstances, without being detected, took the island of Malta from the ancient order of knights who had held it for centuries almost as an afterthought on the way, and landed in Egypt in July, where Bonaparte's army, in a battle fought within sight of the pyramids, and forever remembered by that name, shattered the forces of the Mamluk warrior caste that had effectively ruled Egypt for centuries under nominal Ottoman sovereignty, using the same disciplined infantry squares and concentrated firepower that had served him so well in Italy against an enemy whose magnificent cavalry charges, brave as they were, belonged to an entirely earlier age of warfare. It was on land another spectacular and rapid triumph, and it is here that Bonaparte, ever alert to the value of a resonant phrase, is said to have addressed his troops with the pyramids in view, and told them that 40 centuries of history were looking down upon them, a line that, true or embellished, captures perfectly the theatrical, historically self-conscious way this particular general always understood his own actions as episodes being written, even as they happened, for the judgment of posterity. But land victories, however dazzling, could not undo what happened at sea only weeks later, and it is worth pausing here on a piece of the story that the legend of Napoleon often glosses over too quickly, because it shows us plainly the limits of even his formidable will. On the 1st of August 1798, Admiral Nelson finally located the French fleet that had carried Bonaparte's army to Egypt, anchored in Aboukir Bay along the Egyptian coast, and attacked it in a battle that has gone down in naval history as the Battle of the Nile, a battle in which the British fleet, through a combination of Nelson's own tactical audacity and a fatal complacency on the part of the French admiral, who had anchored his ships in a line he believed too close to shoreline shoals to be attacked from the landward side, annihilated the French fleet almost completely, sinking or capturing all but 2 of its 13 ships of the line in a single night of catastrophic, fire-lit violence that culminated in the explosion of the French flagship L'Orient, a blast so tremendous that it was heard, by some accounts, from many miles away, and that silenced the guns of both fleets, briefly, in a kind of stunned universal pause. Bonaparte's army was, in an instant, cut off from France, trapped in Egypt with no way home by sea, its fate now dependent entirely on what its general could improvise on land. He pushed on regardless, marching a portion of his army north into Ottoman Syria the following spring in an attempt to preempt an Ottoman counter-offensive, capturing the town of Jaffa in a siege whose aftermath deserves to be told honestly, rather than skipped past, because in the days following the town's fall, several thousand Ottoman soldiers who had surrendered on a promise of safe conduct were, on Bonaparte's own order, marched to the beach and executed, by bayonet to conserve ammunition, a massacre that Bonaparte later justified to himself and to others as a grim military necessity, since he had neither the food to feed so many prisoners nor the ships to transport them, and it is worth letting that justification sit exactly as uncomfortably as it deserves to sit, because it is the first, but very far from the last, moment in this story where the cold, purely instrumental logic of Bonaparte's military calculation overrode, without any apparent hesitation, an explicit promise given to men who had trusted it. The Syrian campaign ground to a halt at the fortress town of Acre on the Mediterranean coast, where a scratch garrison of Ottoman troops, reinforced and resupplied by a British naval squadron, held out for 2 gruelling months against repeated French assaults, and where an outbreak of bubonic plague began moving through Bonaparte's own camp, a horror that the general, to his credit, insisted on visiting in person, touching plague-stricken soldiers in a hospital ward in a calculated and, by most accounts, genuinely brave display meant to steady the nerve of an army beginning to fray. But Acre did not fall, and by the summer of 1799, with his army wasted by disease and his strategic position in the region collapsing, Bonaparte retreated back into Egypt, and there, that August, made a decision that historians have argued over ever since, and that deserves to be placed before you plainly, without softening, because it tells you a great deal about the man at the very centre of this whole enormous story. Having learned, through smuggled newspapers, that the political situation in Paris had grown chaotic, and that the Directory's authority was crumbling amid renewed military defeats on other fronts, Bonaparte quietly selected a handful of officers and loyal companions, boarded a small, fast frigate under cover of darkness, and sailed for France, abandoning the army of nearly 30,000 men he still commanded in Egypt to the charge of one of his subordinate generals, without so much as a formal public farewell to the men who had followed him across a desert and a plague and a lost fleet. He would later argue, and would go on arguing for the rest of his life, that he left because France needed him more urgently than Egypt did, that a general's duty to his nation could, in extraordinary circumstances, outweigh his duty to the particular soldiers immediately under his command. His enemies, then and since, called it simply what it also plainly was, an act of ambition placing itself, without much visible agonizing, above the men whose loyalty had built his entire career. Both of those things, as is so often true of this story and of the man at its centre, were true at once. The army he left behind fought on in Egypt for 2 more years before finally surrendering to a British and Ottoman force in 1801, a costly, largely forgotten postscript to an adventure whose only durable legacy, in the end, was not military or strategic at all, but scholarly. The savants he had brought along catalogued Egyptian antiquities with a thoroughness that effectively founded the modern discipline of Egyptology, and one of his soldiers, digging fortifications near the town of Rosetta, unearthed a broken slab of black stone carved in 3 ancient scripts that would, a generation later, finally allow scholars to read the hieroglyphs of the pharaohs for for the first time in over 1,000 years. An empire in Egypt was never won. A stone that unlocked 4,000 years of history was, almost by accident, found. The 18th of Brumaire. Bonaparte landed on the coast of France in October of 1799 to a welcome that must have told him, within hours, everything he needed to know about how far his personal fortunes had travelled beyond the ordinary hazards a mere returning general might have expected for abandoning his army. Word of the fleet's loss at the Nile and of the grinding failure at Acre had reached France ahead of him, and by any strict accounting he might have returned home to face serious questions about both. Instead, the news that had travelled fastest and loudest through French towns was simply that the hero of Italy, the conqueror of the pyramids, was home, and crowds gathered in the streets of the towns he passed through on his journey to Paris, and the newspapers, ever alert to a story the public wanted, treated his arrival as a kind of national deliverance. The republic he returned to was, in truth, in a genuinely fragile condition. The Directory that governed it, discredited by military reverses on the Rhine and in Italy, by rampant corruption, by a currency in near collapse, and by a political class exhausted after a decade of revolution, terror, reaction, and renewed crisis. So exhausted that a meaningful part of France's political elite, including several of the Directory's own 5 members, had quietly concluded that the current constitutional arrangement could not survive much longer, and had begun looking, with varying degrees of discretion, for a general willing to lend his sword to a change of government. Bonaparte, restless, ambitious, and freshly returned with exactly the kind of untarnished popular glamour that a scheme of this sort required, was approached within weeks of his arrival by one of the Directory's own members, the wily and endlessly adaptable Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, who needed, as he put it with characteristic bluntness, a sword to go with his own plan, and Bonaparte, after briefly weighing his options, agreed to be that sword. The coup that followed, on the 9th and 10th of November, 1799, by the old revolutionary calendar the 18th and 19th of Brumaire in the year 8, unfolded with rather less of the crisp, decisive efficiency that Bonaparte's admirers liked to attribute to everything he touched, and it is worth telling it honestly rather than smoothing it into legend, because the near failure of that second day tells us something important about the man underneath the myth. The plotters manoeuvred the legislative councils, on a pretext of an invented Jacobin conspiracy, to relocate their sessions to the Palace of Saint-Cloud outside Paris, ostensibly for their own safety, where Bonaparte's troops could more easily control the surroundings. But when Bonaparte himself appeared before the Council of 500, the more radical and more numerous of the two legislative bodies, to argue for a new constitutional arrangement, he was met not with the awed deference he seems to have expected, but with genuine, furious uproar, deputies shouting him down as a traitor to the Republic, and by several accounts physically jostling and even striking him, so that he emerged from the chamber pale, shaken, and, for one of the very few recorded moments in his entire public life, visibly at a loss for words. It was not Bonaparte's own eloquence that saved the coup in its final hour, but his younger brother, Lucien, who held the presidency of the very council in an uproar against him, and who, thinking faster than his famous sibling in that particular moment, rushed outside to address the waiting soldiers directly, denouncing the deputies inside as men in the pay of England, and Bonaparte's enemies who had drawn daggers against their own president, a claim of very doubtful accuracy that nonetheless gave the waiting troops the pretext they needed to do what soldiers loyal to a general typically do when given a clear order. They moved into the chamber and cleared it by force. It is worth dwelling for a moment on how close this pivotal turn in European history came to failing outright in a shouting match in a garden palace, because it undercuts usefully any temptation to view what followed as some inevitable unfolding of destiny. The 18th of Brumaire succeeded by the narrowest of margins, rescued in its final hour less by the general everyone remembers than by a quick-witted younger brother history mostly forgets. In the aftermath, a rump of compliant legislators, meeting late into the night under the unmistakable shadow of the soldiers outside, voted to dissolve the Directory and replace it with a new, provisional government of 3 consuls, and within weeks, a new constitution, drafted with Bonaparte's close and increasingly dominant involvement, confirmed him as first consul, holding by far the greatest share of executive power of the 3, able to appoint ministers, propose laws, and command the armed forces essentially without meaningful check from the other 2 consuls, or from a legislature whose various chambers had been deliberately fragmented and weakened, so that no single body could effectively oppose him. The new constitution was, in a gesture that would become a recurring and revealing feature of Bonaparte's entire approach to legitimacy, put to a national plebiscite, a popular vote framed in terms designed to produce overwhelming approval, and it duly returned a result, at least according to the official figures published by a government that controlled every stage of the count, of well over 99% in favour, a number so implausibly lopsided that even sympathetic historians have long since concluded the tally was substantially manipulated. It is worth pausing on that plebiscite gently, because it establishes a pattern that would repeat itself at every subsequent hinge point of Bonaparte's rise to supreme power. Force first, to settle the question that actually mattered, and then a carefully managed popular vote afterward, to dress the settled question in the borrowed clothing of the people's will. Napoleon Bonaparte would spend the rest of his career insisting, not entirely without some genuine basis, that he ruled by the consent and for the benefit of the French people, rather than by inherited right the way the old kings had, and he would spend that same career ensuring, through censorship, through controlled elections, and through a secret police apparatus that grew steadily more pervasive as the years went on, that consent was never actually permitted to express itself in any form he had not already predetermined. The architecture of order. Whatever the darker mechanics behind his rise to power, and they deserve, as we have just seen, to be looked at honestly rather than politely overlooked. The years of the consulate that followed, roughly from the end of 1799 through the spring of 1804, represent, by nearly every measure historians use to judge such things, the most genuinely constructive period of Bonaparte's entire public life, and it is worth spending real time here, because the wars that made him famous, and the wars that eventually destroyed him, have a tendency, in the popular imagination, to crowd out just how much peacetime institution building happened in these years, work whose consequences would prove, in some respects, even more durable than any of his battlefield victories. France in 1799 was a nation whose finances were in near collapse, whose currency had been ruined by years of revolutionary inflation, whose legal system was a chaotic patchwork of feudal custom, revolutionary decree, and regional variation so severe that a contract enforceable in one province might be worthless in the next, and whose roads, schools, and administrative machinery had all been starved and disrupted by a decade of upheaval. Bonaparte, who possessed, alongside his gifts as a general, a genuinely rare capacity for rapid, detailed, sustained administrative work, threw himself into the reconstruction of the French state with the same restless, almost compulsive energy he had brought to the battlefield, working by the testimony of exhausted secretaries who struggled to keep pace with him, 18 or more hours in a day, dictating letters and decrees on subjects ranging from the organisation of a new central bank to the precise width of a provincial road. He established the Bank of France in the year 1800, giving the nation, for the first time since the Revolution's currency had collapsed into worthlessness, a stable and centrally managed financial institution capable of restoring confidence in French money, and he reorganised the collection of taxes through a new corps of professional, centrally appointed prefects sent out to every department of France, men who answered directly to Paris and who brought, for the first time in generations, a genuinely uniform and reasonably efficient administration to a country long accustomed to a bewildering patchwork of local privilege and local negligence. He founded a new system of secondary schools, the lycées, intended to produce a trained and loyal administrative and military class drawn on merit rather than inherited privilege. An ideal that Bonaparte, the poor Corsican cadet who had once been mocked for his accent and his empty purse, genuinely seems to have believed in, whatever compromises he made with it elsewhere in his rule. And in 1801, in a move that startled and in some cases outraged his own more fervently anti-clerical revolutionary allies, he negotiated a formal agreement, a concordat, with Pope Pius VII, restoring the Catholic Church's legal standing in France after a decade in which revolutionary governments had persecuted, suppressed, and in some periods actively tried to replace it. A settlement that Bonaparte, who held no very deep personal religious conviction of his own by most credible accounts, pursued for coldly practical reasons, understanding, with the same clear analytical eye he brought to a battlefield, that a France still at war with its own church could never be a fully stable or governable France, and that reconciling the revolution with religion, however contradictory that project looked to committed revolutionaries and committed royalists alike, was the price of durable domestic peace. Of all the accomplishments of these years, though, the one that would outlive Napoleon Bonaparte's empire by the widest margin, the one still shaping the daily legal lives of hundreds of millions of people on several continents at this very moment, as you lie listening to this in the dark, is the great codification of French civil law that came to be known, almost immediately and with Bonaparte's own enthusiastic blessing, as the Napoleonic Code. France's laws before the Revolution had varied so wildly from region to region, a patchwork of some 360 distinct local legal customs layered over remnants of old Roman law in the south and feudal custom in the north, that legal scholars of the age had joked, only half joking, that a traveller crossing France changed laws as often as he changed horses. Bonaparte personally chairing a substantial number of the drafting sessions himself, by several credible accounts contributing genuinely substantive legal reasoning rather than merely presiding ceremonially, pushed through, in 1804, a single unified civil code for the entire nation, one that enshrined, in clear, plain, deliberately accessible language, several of the Revolution's core and genuinely radical legal principles, the equality of all citizens before the law regardless of birth or rank, the security of private property, the right to choose one's own profession and religion freely, and a civil, secular basis for marriage and inheritance that broke decisively with the old church-dominated legal order. It is worth sitting for a moment with both halves of what that code actually did, because a story told honestly owes you both halves together rather than the flattering one alone. It was, in its foundational principles, a genuinely progressive and genuinely modernising achievement, one that abolished the last vestiges of feudal privilege in French law, and that would go on, carried across Europe first by Napoleon's own conquering armies, and later by the sheer intellectual prestige of its clarity and coherence, to become the direct ancestor of the civil law systems still in force today across France, Belgium, the Netherlands, much of Italy, Spain, Portugal, Poland, Egypt, Louisiana, Quebec, and large parts of Latin America. And it was, in the same breath, a document that formally and explicitly subordinated married women to their husbands, stripping them of independent legal control over property and earnings, and requiring, by its plain text, a wife's obedience to her husband in terms that even some contemporaries found regressive, by comparison with certain of the Revolution's own earlier, briefly more egalitarian family laws, and it was extended a few years later to the French colonies in a form that reintroduced and formally codified slavery in territories where revolutionary law had, in 1794, abolished it, a decision driven substantially by the economic interests of Bonaparte's wife's own family connections in the sugar-rich colony of Martinique, and by Bonaparte's own explicit conviction that the profitable colonial economy could not function without enslaved labour. that led directly to a brutal war to reimpose slavery on the colony of Saint-Domingue, a war French forces ultimately lost to the armies of the formerly enslaved population there, whose victory would soon give the world the independent nation of Haiti. Progress and its opposite extended by the same pen in the very same years. It is a pairing this whole story will ask you to hold in your two hands together more than once before the night is through. A crown taken, not given. By 1802, Bonaparte's accumulating prestige, built now on a genuine record of both battlefield and administrative accomplishment, allowed him to secure, through yet another carefully stage-managed plebiscite, his appointment as First Consul for life, with the explicit right to name his own successor, a title that stopped only barely short, in substance if not yet in name, of hereditary monarchy. And 2 years later, in the spring of 1804, following the uncovering of a genuine royalist assassination plot against him, a plot whose exposure Bonaparte and his ministers used, with considerable political skill, to argue that only a hereditary imperial title, immune to the constant temptation of coup and assassination that a merely elected office invited, could secure France's hard-won stability, the Senate proclaimed him Emperor of the French, a title once again ratified by an implausibly lopsided plebiscite. The coronation itself, staged at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris on the 2nd of December 1804, was choreographed by Bonaparte down to the smallest visual detail, a vast and deliberately overwhelming spectacle of restored monarchical splendour, complete with ermine robes and a laurel-wreathed golden crown modelled self-consciously on the imagery of ancient Rome, and Pope Pius VII himself, persuaded to travel from Rome to lend the ceremony the maximum possible religious legitimacy, was present in the cathedral to bless the proceedings. And then came the single gesture from that entire elaborate day that has echoed longest through the 2 centuries since, because at the climactic moment of the ceremony, rather than allow the Pope to place the imperial crown upon his head, as tradition and every crowned monarch before him would have expected, Napoleon Bonaparte reached out, took the crown into his own 2 hands, and placed it upon his own head himself, and then, in a smaller but no less pointed gesture, crowned his wife Josephine as Empress with his own hands as well. Whether this was planned from the start, as most credible accounts suggest, or improvised in the moment, as a few more romantic tellings prefer, its meaning was unmistakable to everyone in that cathedral and to every court in Europe that read the reports afterward. This crown, the gesture announced without a single word being spoken, was not a gift bestowed by the Church, nor an inheritance passed down through some ancient bloodline, but an achievement seized and held by a man who considered himself answerable in the end to no earthly or divine authority higher than his own extraordinary will and his own extraordinary deeds. The son of the provincial Corsican lawyer, the boy once mocked at Brienne for his accent and his poverty, was now, at 35 years old, Emperor of the French. He had climbed, in barely more than a decade, from an unemployed and disgraced junior officer to the throne of the most powerful nation on the European continent. And the wars that would carry his name and his armies across the length and breadth of that continent, wars that had, in truth, never really stopped simmering throughout these very years of reform and coronation, were about to begin in earnest. The camp at Boulogne and the war that came instead. Even as Bonaparte occupied himself with codes and concordats and the elaborate choreography of his own coronation, one enemy had never stopped fighting him, and had never made peace that lasted for more than a brief, uneasy pause. The Kingdom of Great Britain, whose navy ruled the seas as completely as Bonaparte's armies were coming to rule the European mainland, and whose government, under a long and largely unbroken succession of ministries deeply hostile to revolutionary and then imperial France, regarded the man now calling himself Emperor as an intolerable menace to the balance of power that had, for generations, kept any single, continental state from growing dangerously dominant over all the others. Along the cliffs above the port of Boulogne, on the French side of the narrow channel separating France from England, Bonaparte spent much of 1803 and 1804 assembling an enormous invasion force, the Army of England as it was called, a camp of well over 100,000 men drilled to a pitch of readiness and discipline that would, within a year, make it the deadliest fighting force in Europe, all of it waiting only for the French and allied Spanish fleets to win, even briefly, the naval control of the Channel that a cross-water invasion would require. That control never came. In October of 1805, off a headland on the southwestern coast of Spain called Cape Trafalgar, the combined French and Spanish fleet, attempting to break out of blockade and support Bonaparte's broader strategic ambitions, met the British fleet under the same Admiral Nelson who had shattered French naval power once already at the Nile, and in a battle whose tactics, an audacious perpendicular assault that cut the enemy line into 3 isolated and mutually unsupportable segments, are still studied in naval academies today. The British fleet destroyed or captured more than half the combined force without losing a single one of its own ships. Nelson himself was struck down by a French sharpshooter's bullet in the moment of his greatest triumph, dying below decks aboard his flagship as the battle he had won raged on around him, and his death, mourned across Britain with a depth of national grief usually reserved for fallen monarchs, only sealed the near-mythic status the victory would hold in British memory for the 2 centuries since. For Napoleon, the practical consequence was blunt and permanent. Whatever else his empire might become, it would never again seriously threaten a cross-channel invasion of Britain, and the small island kingdom, secure behind a navy no continental power could match, would remain for the rest of his reign. An enemy he could isolate and economically strangle but never actually conquer. But even as the ships burned off Trafalgar, Bonaparte's attention and his enormous, superbly drilled Army of England had already turned elsewhere, because Britain, unable to fight Bonaparte alone on land, had spent that same year assembling, through a combination of subsidy payments and diplomatic persuasion, a new continental coalition against him, the third such alliance in a decade, drawing in Austria and Russia, whose young Tsar Alexander I viewed the self-crowned French emperor with a mixture of personal fascination and genuine ideological alarm. Learning that Austrian forces were massing to strike into Bavaria, a French ally in southern Germany, before his own preparations were complete, Bonaparte performed one of the single most impressive logistical feats of his entire career. Breaking camp at Boulogne and marching the same Army of England, now renamed the Grande Armée, more than 400 miles across France and into southern Germany in barely more than a month, a movement of well over 100,000 men, coordinated across multiple parallel roads, with a precision of staff work that owed a great deal to the meticulous administrative reforms Bonaparte had spent the preceding years imposing on French military organisation. The Austrian commander, General Mack, expecting the French to arrive, in the old and more leisurely style of 18th century campaigning, from the direction of the Rhine, found himself instead nearly surrounded at the fortress town of Ulm, before he'd grasped that the entire strategic picture had already shifted beneath him, and in October of 1805, in a battle that was scarcely a battle at all so much as an elegantly executed encirclement, an entire Austrian army of roughly 25,000 men surrendered to Bonaparte almost without a serious general engagement, a triumph of manoeuvre over bloodshed that Bonaparte considered, by his own later account, among the most satisfying of his entire career, precisely because it had been won with so comparatively little loss of life on either side. Austerlitz. With the Austrian field army at Ulm eliminated and Vienna itself occupied without resistance that November, Bonaparte advanced his army, now considerably smaller and more strung out than the force he had commanded weeks earlier, into Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, to confront the combined Austrian and Russian armies, personally accompanied by both the Austrian Emperor Francis and the Russian Tsar Alexander, who together commanded a force substantially larger than Bonaparte's own. What followed, on the 2nd of December 1805, on the first anniversary, deliberately chosen, of his own imperial coronation, has gone down in military history simply as Austerlitz, and it stands, by the judgment of nearly every serious historian who has studied it since, as the single most complete and most perfectly executed battlefield victory of Bonaparte's entire career, a battle he himself would later call, from the isolation of his final exile, the finest he ever fought. The plan he devised was a deception on a genuinely grand scale, recognising that the Allied commanders, flush with the confidence of their numerical advantage and eager to cut the French army off from its line of retreat, intended to attack and envelop what looked like a weakly held French right flank. Bonaparte deliberately thinned that very flank still further, inviting the attack while concealing the bulk of his own strength, including a full corps he had ordered to force march through the night to reach the field in time, in the mists and low ground near the village of Austerlitz itself. He even withdrew, the evening before the battle, from a defensible height called the Pratzen Heights, that dominated the centre of the coming battlefield, a retreat that the Allied commanders read, exactly as Bonaparte intended them to read it, as a sign of French weakness and hesitation, and that persuaded them to weaken their own centre in order to reinforce the flanking attack they now believed would deliver a decisive victory. It was a trap, laid with a patience and a psychological precision that few commanders in history have matched, and on the morning of the battle itself, as a heavy fog lifted off the low ground to reveal the Allied centre, thinned exactly as Bonaparte had gambled it would be, he gave the order for his own concealed and freshly arrived corps to storm back up the Pratzen Heights and split the Allied army in two. What followed was less a single clash than a controlled, methodical dismantling. The Allied flanking attack, launched against the weakened French right exactly as planned, became trapped and increasingly isolated as the French centre now held the high ground behind it, and in one of the battle's most terrible and most vividly remembered episodes, retreating Russian troops, fleeing across a series of frozen ponds in an attempt to escape the closing French pincer, found the ice shattered beneath them by French artillery fire according to the version of events Bonaparte's own bulletins were quick to popularise. Though modern historians have found the evidence for large numbers of drowned men considerably thinner than the legend suggests, a detail worth noting honestly rather than repeating simply because it makes for a more dramatic telling. By the close of that short winter day, the combined Austrian and Russian army had suffered catastrophic losses, tens of thousands killed, wounded or captured, against comparatively modest French casualties, and the coalition that had seemed, only weeks before, capable of crushing Bonaparte between two great continental powers, simply came apart. Emperor Francis of Austria sued for peace within days. Tsar Alexander withdrew what remained of his shattered army back toward Russia, humiliated and, for the moment, thoroughly convinced of the futility of confronting this particular French emperor on an open battlefield of his own choosing. The peace that followed, the Treaty of Pressburg, stripped Austria of substantial territories in Italy and southern Germany, and effectively ended, within another year, the 1,000-year-old political fiction of the Holy Roman Empire itself, that ancient and by then largely ceremonial confederation of German states nominally headed by the Habsburg emperors, which Francis formally dissolved in 1806 rather than watch it be reorganised entirely on Napoleon's own terms. It is worth pausing here, in the glow of what was, by any measure, the single most dazzling military achievement of Bonaparte's career, to notice something that the excitement of the victory itself tends to obscure, which is what battles like Austerlitz actually cost, in a currency the bulletins never fully totalled. Something in the range of 16,000 to 25,000 men, French and Allied combined, by the more careful modern estimates, were killed or wounded or vanished into captivity in the space of a single winter afternoon, along the low hills and frozen ponds of a corner of Moravia that almost none of them had ever heard of before that autumn. Ordinary conscripted soldiers, sons and husbands and brothers drawn from farms and workshops across 3 empires, whose individual names filled no bulletin and whose individual deaths registered in the official tallies kept by their commanders as nothing more than a subtracted number in a ledger of the acceptable price of a decisive victory. We will have reason, again and again, as this long night continues, to come back to that ledger and to the human weight pressed flat beneath every one of the extraordinary victories this story is about to carry you through, because a story that only remembers the manoeuvre and the glory and forgets the cost paid by men whose names have simply not survived is not, in any honest sense, the whole story at all. Breaking Prussia. The Kingdom of Prussia had watched the campaign of 1805 from the sidelines, its own government divided between a cautious faction, wary of provoking the French Emperor and a war party, encouraged by the Queen, Louise, who argued that Prussia's own glittering military reputation, inherited from the age of Frederick the Great, and by 1806 resting almost entirely on that inheritance, rather than on any serious modernisation since, demanded a stronger response to Bonaparte's steadily expanding influence over the German states. By the autumn of 1806, provoked by Bonaparte's creation of a new confederation of the Rhine, a league of German states bound directly to France and clearly intended, in the long run, to absorb Prussian influence in the region entirely, the war party in Berlin prevailed, and Prussia, without waiting for its Russian ally to fully mobilise in support, declared war and marched to meet the French army it still imagined, on the strength of memories 40 years stale, to be substantially its inferior. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, and it was punished with a speed that shocked even observers who had already watched Bonaparte dismantle Austria at Ulm and Austerlitz the year before. On the 14th of October 1806, in twin battles fought simultaneously some 12 miles apart at Jena and at Auerstedt, French forces under Bonaparte himself at Jena and under one of his most capable marshals, Louis-Nicolas Davout, at Auerstedt, destroyed the main Prussian army in a single day, Davout's single corps, remarkably, defeating a Prussian force nearly twice its own size through superior tactical cohesion and sheer disciplined nerve. The Prussian army, an institution whose reputation had rested for decades on a kind of inherited, almost ceremonial prestige rather than on any genuine ongoing modernisation of its tactics or its officer corps, simply came apart in the pursuit that followed, fortress after fortress surrendering to French cavalry patrols with barely a shot fired, in a collapse so total and so humiliating that it triggered, within the Prussian state itself, a genuine and far-reaching programme of military and administrative reform in the years that followed, reforms whose long-term consequences would, in a twist this story will circle back to before the night is over, help undo Bonaparte's own empire less than a decade later. Bonaparte entered Berlin in triumph that October, and there, in a gesture calculated for maximum symbolic effect on both French and German audiences, he paid a visit to the tomb of Frederick the Great, the very monarch whose military legend Prussia had just watched collapse, and took, as a trophy to be sent back to Paris, the dead king's own ceremonial sword. It was also in occupied Berlin that November that Bonaparte issued a decree that would shape the following 6 years of European history nearly as much as any battle, the Berlin Decree establishing what came to be called the Continental System, an ambitious and ultimately ruinous scheme of economic warfare aimed at the one enemy his armies had never managed to defeat directly. Unable to invade Britain after Trafalgar and unable, despite Trafalgar's aftermath, to bring the British government to terms through negotiation, Bonaparte resolved instead to strangle the British economy by closing every port on the European continent under his control or under the control of any state allied to or intimidated by him to British trade, reasoning that an island nation so dependent on its export markets and its access to continental goods could eventually be forced into economic collapse and, from there, into a peace settlement on French terms. It was, in its ambition, a strategy that anticipated by more than a century the kind of total economic warfare that would become commonplace in the conflicts of the following age, and it was, in its execution, a policy that proved almost impossible to enforce completely across a continent riddled with smugglers, sympathetic local officials, and economic interests in nation after nation that depended on exactly the British trade the decree forbade. Enforcing the continental system would in fact become one of the great recurring headaches of Bonaparte's later reign, dragging him into fresh wars and fresh occupations in Portugal and eventually in Spain, and, in the end, catastrophically in Russia. Precisely because those nations' own economic self-interest kept quietly undermining a blockade that French power alone could never fully police. And it is worth marking that irony now, early, because it will return again and again as this long night story unfolds. An emperor who could shatter any army sent against him found himself, again and again, defeated not by armies at all, but by the simple, stubborn, unglamorous economics of ordinary people's need to trade. Poland and the ice of Eylau and the peace at Tilsit. With Prussia broken, Bonaparte turned his attention to the Russian army still in the field, advancing into Poland, a nation that had been carved up and erased from the map of Europe by Prussia, Austria and Russia in a series of partitions in the decades before the revolution, and whose people, still fiercely nationalist and still hoping for restoration, greeted the French emperor's arrival with a genuine hopeful enthusiasm that Bonaparte, ever alert to a useful ally, encouraged without ever quite committing himself to the full restoration of Polish independence that so many Poles desperately wanted. A calculated ambiguity that would leave a lasting mark of disappointment on the relationship between Bonaparte and a people who fought for him, in substantial numbers and with real devotion, for the rest of his reign. It was here, too, in the Polish city of Warsaw that winter, that Bonaparte began a love affair with a young Polish noblewoman named Marie Walewska, a relationship that, unlike so much of the calculated dynastic manoeuvring that surrounded his life, seems by most credible accounts to have involved genuine mutual affection on both sides, and that would, several years later, produce a son. The campaign against Russia's army that winter, though, offered none of the clean decisive triumph of Austerlitz, and it is worth spending real time on the battle fought that February at Eylau in East Prussia, because it stands as one of the grimmest and least glorious episodes of Bonaparte's entire career. A battle fought in a raging blizzard so thick that entire columns of infantry lost sight of each other in the swirling snow, in temperatures cold enough to freeze the wounded where they fell before help could reach them. The fighting on the 8th of February 1807 was a nearly formless, murderous slog, lacking anything resembling the elegant manoeuvre of Bonaparte's earlier triumphs, decided in its most desperate hour by a massive, near-suicidal charge of French cavalry, some 11,000 horsemen thrown forward almost as a last resort to blunt a collapsing French centre. A charge that succeeded in stabilising the line, but at a cost in dead men and dead horses that appalled even veteran officers who had already seen a great deal of this war's carnage. By the battle's inconclusive end, both armies had suffered horrific losses, quite possibly 25,000 casualties or more on each side by some estimates, without either side achieving anything that could honestly be called a victory, and Bonaparte's own bulletins, ever alert to the management of his public legend, worked hard to frame the outcome as a French triumph, a framing that few of the officers who had actually stood on that frozen field, surveying the drifts of dead men and horses the following morning, seemed to have privately believed. It is worth sitting with Eylau for a moment, precisely because it does not fit the legend so comfortably, because it shows us a Bonaparte capable of leading men into a bloody, nearly pointless stalemate as easily as into a masterpiece of manoeuvre, and because the men who died in those snowdrifts, in a battle whose outcome changed remarkably little in the end, deserve to be remembered as more than a footnote on the road to the battle that actually settled the campaign. That settling battle came 4 months later, in June, at Friedland, where Bonaparte, given time to regroup and reinforce after the mauling at Eylau, caught a substantial part of the Russian army in a badly chosen position with a river at its back, and inflicted a defeat serious enough, combined with the general exhaustion of a campaign that had now dragged on brutally for the better part of a year, to bring Tsar Alexander to the negotiating table at last. The peace that followed concluded that July, on a specially constructed raft moored in the middle of the Niemen River, the border between French-influenced and Russian territory, remains one of the most theatrically staged diplomatic encounters in modern European history. The two emperors meeting alone, without ministers present at the first crucial session, on a lavishly decorated pavilion built upon the raft itself, a piece of stagecraft entirely characteristic of Bonaparte's lifelong instinct for turning even the most consequential diplomacy into a piece of visual and symbolic theatre. The treaties of Tilsit that resulted were, on their face, remarkably generous to the defeated Alexander, whom Bonaparte, in one of the more genuinely curious episodes of personal chemistry in this whole story, appears to have found charming and had hoped, with real if ultimately misplaced optimism, to win over as a durable partner in a grand reordering of Europe between their two empires, an eastern and a western half of the continent governed, in Bonaparte's imagining, in a kind of managed partnership. Prussia, by sharp contrast, was treated with a harshness that reflected Bonaparte's evident contempt for its king, Frederick William III, stripped of roughly half its territory and population, saddled with a crushing indemnity, and reduced for the remainder of Bonaparte's reign to something close to a client state occupied by French garrisons it could not afford to feed. Out of formerly Prussian and Austrian Polish territory, Bonaparte carved a new Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a gesture toward the Polish nationalism he had encouraged without ever fully honouring, and along the North Sea coast and elsewhere across northern Germany, new client kingdoms and territories were assembled, several of them, in a pattern that would become one of the defining features of Bonaparte's empire, handed to members of his own family to rule. By the autumn of 1807, barely 3 years after his coronation, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at a height of continental power that no single European ruler had approached since the age of Charlemagne 1,000 years before. Austria and Prussia, the two great powers of Central Europe, lay humbled and effectively subordinate to French interests. Russia, for the moment at least, was an ally rather than an enemy. Britain remained defiant behind its navy, but isolated, its trade with the European mainland choked, in theory, if never quite in complete practice, by the continental system. Across France itself, and the widening ring of territories and client states surrounding it, the Napoleonic Code was being extended, the metric system was spreading, and a new administrative and legal order, modelled directly on the reforms of the consulate years, was being imposed, sometimes welcomed by populations eager to escape older forms of feudal privilege, sometimes bitterly resented as the imposition of a foreign occupier's will. It must have seemed to Bonaparte and to much of Europe alike in that particular season that the emperor's ambitions had very nearly exhausted the available map. They had not. Two fronts remained where his particular genius for concentrated, decisive continental battle would prove, in the years just ahead, unexpectedly and then catastrophically inadequate to the kind of war actually being fought against him, and it is to the first and slower burning of those two fronts, a war that Bonaparte himself would later call, from the bitterness of his final exile, the wound that killed him by degrees, that we turn next, the Spanish ulcer. The Kingdom of Spain had been, since 1795, an uneasy and increasingly resentful ally of France. Its government under the corrupt and widely despised Chief Minister Manuel de Godoy, tied to Bonaparte's fortunes largely because it had no better alternative, and its royal family headed by the weak and indecisive King Charles IV, torn by a bitter internal feud with the king's own son and heir, Ferdinand, who hoped, with Bonaparte's help to force his father from the throne. Bonaparte, observing this dysfunction with the same cold, opportunistic calculation he had once applied to the ancient Republic of Venice, concluded, in the early months of 1808, that Spain's Bourbon monarchy was simply too weak and too divided to be trusted as a reliable partner in enforcing the continental system along its long Atlantic coastline, and resolved to remove it altogether and replace it with a monarch of his own choosing. Using the pretext of moving French troops through Spain to reinforce an ongoing campaign against Portugal, another recalcitrant partner in the continental system, Bonaparte instead occupied Spain's own major cities and fortresses, and then, in a piece of diplomatic manoeuvring as cynical as anything in his entire career, lured the feuding king and his son both to the French border town of Bayonne, under the pretence of mediating their quarrel, and there, through a mixture of pressure, threats, and outright coercion, forced both of them to renounce the Spanish throne entirely in favour of Bonaparte's own elder brother Joseph, who was, within weeks, installed in Madrid as King of Spain. It was, by the calculations that had served Bonaparte so reliably in Italy and in Central Europe, a clean and efficient solution to an unreliable ally. Remove a weak and divided royal house, install a loyal Bonaparte, and the whole Spanish problem, he seems genuinely to have believed, would resolve itself within weeks. It was instead the single greatest strategic miscalculation of his entire reign, and it is worth understanding clearly why, because the reason cuts to the very heart of what Bonaparte's whole military system was built to do, and to what it was never built to do. The armies Bonaparte had spent his career defeating, at Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland, were the armies of dynastic states, professional forces fighting on behalf of kings and emperors whose own survival, and whose own willingness to continue a war, could be decisively settled by the destruction of that army in a single great battle or a short, sharp campaign. Break the army, capture or humble the monarch, and the war, by the accepted logic of 18th century statecraft, was over. Spain in 1808 did not fight that kind of war. When news reached Madrid of what had happened at Bayonne, the Spanish people rose in a spontaneous, furious, decentralized popular revolt that had no single army for Bonaparte's marshals to defeat, and no single monarch whose capture could end it. A war fought instead by irregular bands, guerrillas, a word the conflict itself gave to the world's vocabulary, striking French supply lines and isolated garrisons, and then melting back into a countryside whose terrain, whose church, and whose fierce local loyalties all worked against the occupier at every turn. It was a war of ambushes and reprisals for reprisals. A war the Spanish painter Francisco Goya would later record in a series of etchings so unflinching in their depiction of atrocity on both sides. Mutilated corpses, summary executions, the ordinary horror inflicted on ordinary people caught between two furies, that they remain, 2 centuries later, among the most powerful visual indictments of war ever created by a single human hand. And it is worth pausing gently to let that art stand as its own testimony here, because Goya saw and recorded what the triumphant bulletins from Bonaparte's earlier campaigns had always been careful never to show. Britain, ever alert to an opportunity to bleed its great continental enemy on ground where the Royal Navy could keep an expeditionary force supplied by sea, poured money, arms, and eventually a substantial army under a rising general named Arthur Wellesley, who would in time be given the title by which history remembers him, the Duke of Wellington, into supporting the Spanish and Portuguese resistance, and across the following 6 years, in a grinding, seesawing campaign of sieges and marches across the harsh terrain of the Iberian Peninsula, Wellington's disciplined, defensively minded army, combined with the ceaseless, exhausting drain of Spanish guerrilla warfare on French supply lines and French morale, turned Spain into precisely the running saw Bonaparte himself would later name it, the Spanish ulcer, a wound that never fully closed and that steadily consumed, year after year, some of his best marshals, hundreds of thousands of French soldiers, and a share of his empire's total military resources that historians have estimated, at various points in the conflict, at close to 1/3 men tied down on a single peripheral front, resources that would be desperately, catastrophically missed on a very different front a few years later. It is worth marking, honestly, what the Peninsular War actually reveals about the limits of Bonaparte's genius, because that genius, extraordinary as it plainly was on a battlefield of massed regular armies, had almost no effective answer to a war fought by an entire armed population, refusing, in its scattered, stubborn, uncoordinated millions, to accept that it had already been defeated. Wagram and the Austrian marriage. Watching Bonaparte's army bogged down in Spain, and encouraged by a genuine, and in this case correctly judged, sense that the moment of French vulnerability had arrived, Austria, still smarting from the humiliation of Austerlitz and Pressburg, and reorganised in the intervening years under a genuinely reformed and modernised army, declared war again in the spring of 1809, hoping to catch Bonaparte overextended and to rally the rest of Europe to a war of national liberation against French domination. Bonaparte, forced to rush back from dealing personally with the Spanish crisis, assembled an army with rather less of the overwhelming numerical and qualitative advantage he had enjoyed in 1805, and the campaign that followed, fought along the Danube in the spring and summer of that year, gave Europe its first real glimpse of a Bonaparte who could, in fact, be checked, even if not yet decisively beaten. At the Battle of Aspern-Essling in May, an Austrian army under the capable Archduke Charles inflicted for the first time in Bonaparte's career an outright tactical defeat on the Emperor personally commanding the field, forcing a costly French withdrawal back across the Danube and killing, among many thousands of others, one of Bonaparte's most trusted and longest-serving marshals, Jean Lannes, whose death, from wounds suffered in the battle, affected Bonaparte, by the testimony of those who were with him in the following days, more visibly and more personally than almost any other single loss of the entire war. Bonaparte regrouped, reinforced, and returned to the fight 6 weeks later at Wagram, where, across 2 days of some of the largest and most costly fighting Europe had yet seen in this long cycle of wars, well over 300,000 men engaged on a single battlefield, and tens of thousands fell, he finally forced the Archduke's army to withdraw, a victory, but a narrower and far bloodier one than Austerlitz had been, won as much through sheer grinding attrition and the concentrated fire of a massive artillery battery. Bonaparte personally massed at the battle's critical hour as through the kind of elegant, decisive manoeuvre that had made his earlier reputation. The peace that followed Wagram stripped Austria of further territory and population, but it was the personal and dynastic consequences of this fourth Austrian defeat that would matter more in the longer arc of this story than the territorial terms themselves. Bonaparte, now 40 years old, had spent more than a decade married to Josephine, a marriage that had brought him, by most credible accounts, genuine and lasting affection, even through periods of mutual infidelity and long separation, but that had brought him no child, no heir to inherit the vast empire he had assembled. And as the years passed, Bonaparte's anxiety about the fragility of a dynasty resting entirely on his own single, mortal life grew into something close to an obsession, one that finally, in the winter of 1809, overrode whatever personal feeling remained, and he divorced Josephine in a ceremony conducted, by all accounts, with real and mutual grief on both sides, Bonaparte reportedly weeping openly, an emperor otherwise so famous for the icy control of his public emotions, dissolving with his own hand the one relationship in his adult life that seems to have approached, for however imperfect a stretch of years, something like genuine love. In her place, seeking both an heir and a decisive dynastic alliance with one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious royal houses, Bonaparte married, in 1810, the Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, a niece of the very Marie Antoinette whose execution during the Revolution had, only 17 years before, sent shockwaves of royal solidarity through every court in Europe, a marriage that stunned observers on both sides of the negotiating table with the sheer speed of its reversal in relations between France and the House of Habsburg, and that produced, within a year, the son Bonaparte had wanted so desperately, a boy given, at birth, the grand and unmistakable title King of Rome, the empire at its height. By 1811, in the brief glittering season before everything began, very suddenly to come apart, Napoleon Bonaparte governed, directly or through subordinate rulers bound to him by conquest, treaty or blood, an expanse of Europe larger than any single authority had controlled since the Roman Empire at its own height. France itself had grown, through direct annexation, to include modern Belgium, the Netherlands, and a long stretch of the German and Italian coastlines, its formal departments extending, by the time of the empire's greatest territorial extent, as far as Hamburg in the north and Rome itself in the south. The Pope, Pius VII, who had once travelled to Paris to crown Bonaparte emperor, now held as something close to a prisoner after a bitter falling out over the continental system and the final absorption of the Papal States into the French Empire. Beyond the borders of France proper stretched a wide ring of client kingdoms, most of them ruled by Bonaparte's own siblings, in a family arrangement that has no real precedent in the history of European statecraft. His brother Joseph, moved on from the throne of Naples, sat uneasily on the throne of Spain, fighting a war he had never wanted against a people who never accepted him. His brother Louis ruled the Kingdom of Holland, where he took his responsibilities to his Dutch subjects seriously enough, and resisted the continental system's enforcement firmly enough to protect Dutch trade, that he eventually fell out badly with his own increasingly furious elder brother, and abdicated rather than continue to serve as what he considered merely a French governor in royal disguise. His brother Jerome, the youngest, ruled a newly invented Kingdom of Westphalia, stitched together out of German territory, presiding over a court modelled with almost comic extravagance on the splendour of Bonaparte's own imperial court in Paris. His sister Caroline and her husband, the flamboyant cavalry commander Joachim Murat we met galloping across revolutionary Paris so many years before, ruled the Kingdom of Naples, and across the wide arc of German and Polish and Italian territory that fell short of outright annexation or family rule, the Confederation of the Rhine and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw and the Kingdom of Italy. This last with Bonaparte himself wearing the ancient iron crown of Lombardy, bound smaller states and their native rulers into a web of alliance, tribute, and conscripted military obligation that made Bonaparte's word, in practice, the final word across nearly the whole of the European mainland, from the Pyrenees to the borders of the Russian Empire itself. It is worth pausing here at this high water mark to survey honestly what that empire actually was for the tens of millions of people living inside it, because the answer, again, refuses to sort itself neatly into either the myth of liberation or the myth of pure tyranny, and both myths have their honest defenders. For many, particularly among the rising middle classes of Western Germany and Italy, French rule brought a genuinely welcome dismantling of the old feudal order, the abolition of ancient guild restrictions and noble privilege, the introduction of the Napoleonic Code with its principle of legal equality, careers opened, at least in theory, to talent rather than birth, in a manner that echoed, deliberately, the very door that had once opened for Bonaparte himself as a poor Corsican cadet. For many others, French rule meant something considerably less welcome, the constant grinding demand of conscription, which fell with particular severity on the populations of these dependent and annexed territories, and which stripped villages, across the empire's later years, of their young men in numbers that left whole regions of the countryside functionally emptied of able-bodied labour, the requisitioning of food, horses and money to sustain occupying garrisons and ongoing wars. the ever-present secret police and censorship apparatus that Bonaparte's own French subjects endured as well, and that grew markedly more intrusive in these years of expanding empire, as any regime built on the constant, unappeasable need to justify its own continued expansion, tends, almost by a kind of internal law, to grow more suspicious of dissent rather than less. Nationalism, too, that combustible political force the French Revolution had itself first unleashed onto the European stage, began, in these very years of Bonaparte's greatest triumph, to turn against its own unintended parent, as Germans and Italians and Spaniards, having watched the French demonstrate so vividly what a people mobilised behind a national idea could accomplish, began to imagine their own nations, freed not merely from their old feudal monarchs, but from this new and equally foreign French master. And it is one of the deep and genuinely poignant ironies threading through this entire story that the revolutionary ideas Bonaparte's own armies carried across Europe, equality before the law, the sovereignty of the people, the nation as the proper object of a citizen's loyalty, would within a few short years be turned by the very peoples who received them into the ideological weapons that helped bring his own empire crashing down. For now, though, in 1811, that reckoning still lay ahead, hidden behind the season's genuine and dazzling splendour. Bonaparte had a son and heir. He had humbled every great continental power that had ever opposed him, Austria 4 times over, Prussia once and completely, and held an uneasy, watchful peace with a Russia he still, for the moment, called an ally. Only Britain remained unbowed, sustained behind its wall of ships and its network of subsidies to whichever continental power was willing, for however brief a season, to take up arms against France once more. And it was that same uneasy Russian alliance, strained for years now by the mounting economic cost the continental system imposed on a Russian nobility whose wealth depended heavily on the very trade with Britain that Bonaparte demanded they abandon, that was about to break apart entirely, and carry Napoleon Bonaparte at the very peak of his power toward the single most catastrophic military campaign in the history of the modern world, the road to Moscow. By the end of 1810, Tsar Alexander, under mounting pressure from a Russian nobility whose export trade in grain and timber had been strangled by 4 years of nominal compliance with the continental system, quietly opened Russian ports once again to neutral shipping that carried, in practice, British goods, a decision Bonaparte regarded correctly as a direct violation of the spirit of the Tilsit Agreement, and, more importantly, as a crack in the wall of the economic blockade upon which his entire strategy for finally forcing Britain to terms depended. The relationship between the two emperors, warm and even genuinely admiring in the glow of that raft on the Niemen 5 years earlier, curdled steadily across the following months into mutual suspicion and mutual insult, each side convinced, not without some justification, that the other intended war, and each side, through 1811 and into the early months of 1812, building toward exactly the confrontation both claimed to wish to avoid. Bonaparte assembled, for the invasion he began planning in earnest that winter, the largest single military force Europe had ever seen gathered under one command. A Grande Armée that swelled once every Allied and satellite contingent was counted. Poles and Austrians and Prussians and Italians and Germans of every client state marching alongside the French corps, to something in the region of 600,000 men, a number so vast that its own commanders struggled to move, feed, and coordinate it across the featureless distances of Eastern Europe, distances that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the compact, densely settled, well-provisioned battlefields of Italy and Germany and Austria, where Bonaparte had built his entire military reputation. It is worth pausing, before a single man crosses the border, to notice what should have been, and to some of Bonaparte's own more clear-eyed marshals actually was, an obvious and glaring warning, because the invasion of Russia would be undone in the end, not primarily by Russian battlefield genius, but by the same brutal arithmetic of distance and supply that had always been the quiet, unglamorous precondition of every one of Bonaparte's earlier triumphs. His entire method of war, the rapid concentration of force, the living off a conquered countryside's granaries and farms to sustain a speed of movement no 18th century army could match, depended absolutely on campaigning in the rich, densely populated agricultural landscapes of Western and Central Europe, where a marching army could reliably requisition enough food from the towns and farms around it to keep moving fast and light. Russia offered no such landscape. Its population was thin and scattered across enormous distances. Its roads were, by Western European standards, barely roads at all, becoming rivers of mud in the spring rains and then freezing into rutted, wheel-breaking ice by autumn. And its own commanders, recognising with a clarity that history has, on the whole, been too slow to credit them for, that they could not hope to defeat Bonaparte's army in the kind of decisive, concentrated battle he was famous for winning, adopted instead a strategy of continuous grinding retreat, drawing the invading army ever deeper into the vastness of Russian territory, burning crops, driving off livestock and destroying supplies behind them as they withdrew, a strategy that horrified and outraged much of the Russian nobility watching their own estates put to the torch by their own retreating army. But that would, across the following months, prove devastatingly, decisively effective. The Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory on the 24th of June 1812, in a crossing so vast that it took the army's leading elements 3 full days simply to complete the passage of the river, and from the very first weeks of the campaign, the army began to bleed men not to Russian bullets, but to the sheer, remorseless strain of the march itself. Heat and dust in the summer weeks, disease spreading through camps whose sanitation had never been designed for a force of this size, horses collapsing by the tens of thousands from exhaustion and from forage that the scorched countryside could no longer supply, and desertion, quiet and steady, among the many non-French contingents whose loyalty to Bonaparte's cause had never run especially deep. By the time the Grande Armée reached the city of Smolensk in mid-August, having marched some 200 miles into Russian territory without the decisive war-ending battle Bonaparte had confidently expected to fight and win within weeks of crossing the frontier the army had already lost, to disease and desertion and exhaustion alone, something in the region of 1/3 of its original strength, a catastrophic attrition that had cost the Russians, by contrast, hardly a man, and that should have told any commander less committed to the momentum of his own legend that the campaign's fundamental premise, a quick Austerlitz-style knockout blow followed by a dictated peace, had already, quietly, failed. Bonaparte pressed on regardless, and the Russian High Command, under mounting political pressure at home to stop simply retreating and to defend the sacred soil of the motherland, finally turned to give battle on the 7th of September at the village of Borodino, roughly 70 miles from Moscow itself, in an engagement that stands by the simple measure of a single day's bloodshed, among the most horrific in the entire history of European warfare before the 20th century. Across some 12 hours of fighting along a shallow, gently rolling stretch of ground, defended by a series of hastily constructed earthen fortifications that changed hands again and again in savage, close-quarters fighting, the two armies, roughly comparable now in size after the losses of the preceding months, hammered each other with an intensity of artillery fire that neither side had ever unleashed at this scale before, something in the range of 100,000 men killed, wounded, or missing between the two armies combined by the close of that single terrible day, a casualty toll that exceeded in absolute numbers the losses of any battle fought anywhere in Europe up to that point in history. Bonaparte himself, unusually for a commander whose earlier career had so often been built on his personal, high-energy presence at the critical point of a battle, fought this one from a curious remove, reportedly unwell, holding back his elite imperial guard from a final decisive commitment that some of his own marshals believed, then and afterward, might have turned a bloody stalemate into the decisive war-ending victory the entire campaign had been designed to achieve. The Russian army, battered but never broken, withdrew from the field in reasonably good order under the command of the aging, cautious general Mikhail Kutuzov, preserving the core of its fighting strength rather than standing to be annihilated, and Bonaparte, having won the field in the narrow tactical sense that mattered to the bulletins, found himself, a week later, marching into an undefended Moscow, having failed, for all that horrific expenditure of blood, to destroy the army that stood between him and the peace. He still, with a stubbornness that by this point in the campaign was shading into something closer to denial, believed was within his grasp. What Bonaparte found waiting for him in Moscow was not the submission he expected, but an emptiness that turned, within days of his triumphant entry, into catastrophe. The city's governor had ordered the evacuation of most of its population before the French arrived, and on the night of the 14th of September, fires, whether set deliberately by Russian agents under the governor's own orders, as most credible modern accounts conclude, or sparked by the chaos of looting French soldiers, as Bonaparte's own bulletins preferred to claim, broke out across the largely wooden city, and, fed by wind and by a lack of any organised firefighting response, burned for the better part of a week, consuming perhaps 3/4 of Moscow's buildings and, with them, the vast stores of food and shelter. Bonaparte's exhausted army had been counting on to see it through the winter that was now, with every passing week, drawing closer. Bonaparte waited in the smoking, half-ruined city for over a month, sending repeated peace overtures to Tsar Alexander that went, one after another, entirely unanswered, clinging in a way that his own most loyal officers found increasingly difficult to understand, to the conviction that the Tsar would eventually see reason and sue for the peace that would let this whole enormous, ruinous campaign end in something that could still, plausibly, be called a French victory. No answer ever came. By the time Bonaparte finally accepted, in the 3rd week of October, that no peace was coming and gave the order to withdraw, the Russian winter and the Russian army under Kutuzov, both freshly rested and reinforced, were waiting. The retreat. What followed, across the 6 weeks between the last week of October and the first days of December 1812, is among the most harrowing sustained catastrophes in the entire military history of the modern world, and it deserves to be told slowly and told honestly, because the scale of human suffering compressed into those 6 weeks resists easy summary. The army that marched out of Moscow, already reduced by the summer's attrition, and the horror of Borodino to perhaps 100,000 men, attempted first to withdraw along a southern route through country that had not yet been stripped bare by the summer's advance. But Kutuzov's army, shadowing the retreat and probing at its flanks in a series of sharp engagements, forced Bonaparte back onto the same ruined, already foraged road the Grande Armée had marched in on months before, a road offering nothing left to eat and nothing left to burn, through a countryside whose peasants, increasingly organised into their own irregular bands, fell upon isolated French stragglers with a ferocity fed by months of pent-up fury at an invading army that had lived quite literally off the confiscated grain of their own villages. Then came the cold, arriving early and settling in with a severity that even veteran soldiers who had endured the frozen horror of Eylau 5 years before had never experienced. Temperatures that fell, by some accounts, to 30 degrees below freezing and lower still as November wore on. Cold so absolute that horses died by the thousands overnight in their traces, that men fell asleep marching and were found frozen where they had dropped, that metal weapons stuck to bare skin and had to be torn away, tearing flesh with them, that the simple, ordinary human tasks of eating and building a fire and keeping one's feet from freezing solid inside boots that had long since worn through, consumed every remaining reserve of will and strength an exhausted, starving man still possessed. Discipline, the very discipline that had made this army the terror of Europe for a decade, dissolved by slow degrees into a desperate, sprawling column of stragglers, many of them Bonaparte's supposed allies from the Confederation of the Rhine and beyond, whose loyalty to a French cause that had brought them to this frozen ruin had, understandably enough, worn as thin as their coats, fighting each other, on occasion, for a scrap of food or a place beside a fire, abandoning the wounded who could no longer keep pace, watching comrades die within arm's reach without, in the numbing exhaustion of it all, the strength left to grieve them properly. The retreat's single most terrible episode came in the last days of November, at the crossing of the Berezina River, where Bonaparte's remaining forces, trapped between two converging Russian armies in a river running high and choked with ice, seemed, for several days, to face total annihilation or surrender, a fate averted only by a genuinely remarkable feat of engineering. French army engineers, working waist-deep in freezing water that killed a number of them outright from exposure even as they worked, constructing two rough pontoon bridges under intermittent Russian artillery fire, allowing the core of the army along with Bonaparte himself to escape across to the western bank. But the bridges could not save everyone, and as Russian forces closed in on the eastern bank and the bridges themselves began to fail under the weight of the panicked crowd trying to cross, thousands of stragglers, camp followers and wounded men were left behind, trampled in the crush, or drowned in the freezing river, or captured or killed by the advancing Russians, a scene of such raw, undifferentiated horror that the very word Berezina entered the French language afterward as a byword for utter catastrophe, a usage that persists in French idiom to this very day. It is worth pausing here, in the coldest and cruelest hour of this entire long story, to notice that nobody, then or since, has ever managed a precise count of how many men actually died at that river crossing alone, swallowed into a single collective horror that the survivors themselves, questioned decades later, could describe only in fragments: a single face, a single cry, remembered out of a chaos too vast for any one witness to have taken in whole. Nobody counted, and so, in any exact sense, nobody will ever know. By the time the remnants of the Grande Armée finally stumbled back across the Niemen River in December, completing the same crossing that 600,000 men had made with such overwhelming confidence less than 6 months before, the army that recrossed numbered, by the most careful modern estimates, perhaps 25 or 30,000 men still capable of bearing arms, though the true, larger figure of survivors, including stragglers, prisoners eventually released, and men who had peeled off along the retreat's edges and made their own scattered way home over the following months, was somewhat higher. Even by the most generous reckoning, the campaign had cost the lives of several 100,000 soldiers, French and Allied together, along with an uncounted and uncountable number of civilian camp followers, Russian peasants, and Moscow's own residents caught in the fires and the fighting. A human toll so staggering that historians have never been able to agree on a single precise figure, and in truth, never fully will, because so much of the dying happened far from any officer keeping a careful ledger, in ditches and frozen fields and the black water of a Russian river, witnessed by no one who lived long enough afterward to report it. Bonaparte himself, in a decision that would echo, with a terrible symmetry, his earlier abandonment of his army in Egypt 13 years before, left the wreck of the Grande Armée in early December, travelling ahead by sleigh in near total secrecy to reach Paris before news of the catastrophe could fully outrun him and destabilise his hold on power, arriving home to a capital that had, in his weeks-long absence and the uncertainty it bred, already weathered one attempted coup by a disaffected general convinced, on the strength of a rumour alone, that the emperor was dead. He was not dead, but the awe of invincibility that had carried him from the frozen ponds of Austerlitz to the very height of continental power had been, in the snow and ice and starvation of that Russian winter, shattered as completely and as irrecoverably as the army he had led there. Word of the catastrophe spread across Europe within weeks, carried by the same fleeing stragglers whose scattered, half-frozen return home told a story no bulletin, however carefully worded, could any longer disguise or soften, and in courts and capitals across the continent that had spent a decade and more believing, with a kind of exhausted, fatalistic resignation, that Napoleon Bonaparte could simply never be beaten. A very different and very dangerous new calculation began, almost immediately, to take shape. If the man could be broken in the snows of Russia, he could, perhaps, be broken again. Germany rises, and the Battle of Nations. Prussia, still nursing the humiliation of Jena and Austerlitz, and, in the intervening years since 1806, quietly and thoroughly rebuilding its army under a group of reforming officers who had studied Bonaparte's own methods with an unsentimental professional attentiveness, and had set about reorganising Prussian conscription, training, and command along strikingly similar lines, was the first great power to break openly with France in the spring of 1813, declaring war within weeks of the last frozen stragglers of the Grande Armée reaching home, and calling, in a wave of newspaper appeals and patriotic sermons that marked a genuinely new departure in European political culture, upon the German people as a whole, not merely upon Prussian subjects, to rise in a war of national liberation against French domination. Austria, watching cautiously from the sidelines through the early months of that year, its own diplomacy under the extraordinarily capable and patient Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich, working to extract the maximum possible advantage from Bonaparte's weakened position before committing itself irrevocably, finally joined the growing coalition against France that August, once a summer's worth of negotiation, had failed to produce a peace settlement Metternich judged durable, bringing the alliance's combined resources to a scale that even a rebuilt Bonaparte, drawing on a fresh and hastily trained new conscript army, the so-called Marie-Louise, boys of 17 and 18 called up years ahead of their ordinary term to replace the veterans lost in Russia, could no longer hope to match on anything like equal terms. Bonaparte, characteristically, fought on with a tactical brilliance that startled his enemies all over again in the campaign's opening months, winning a string of victories that spring and summer against individually smaller Allied forces that had not yet learned to coordinate their movements against him. But the coalition, guided now by a shared strategic understanding, informally called the Trachenberg Plan, that no single Allied army should risk battle directly against Bonaparte himself while he personally commanded it, choosing instead to strike at his subordinate marshals whenever they operated separately, ground down the French Emperor's dwindling resources through a long, exhausting summer of manoeuvre and partial engagement across the German states. By October, the campaign had converged on the city of Leipzig in Saxony, where, across 4 days of fighting from the 16th to the 19th of that month, more than 500,000 soldiers, French and Allied together, drawn from virtually every nation of Europe, clashed in the single largest battle the continent had ever witnessed before the 20th century. A scale of combat so vast that the engagement earned, almost immediately in the language of the age, the name it still carries, the Battle of Nations, a title that captured both its unprecedented size and the genuinely pan-European character of the coalition arrayed, at last in overwhelming and coordinated force against the man who had spent a decade and more, picking off Europe's great powers one and two at a time. Bonaparte, outnumbered by more than 2 to 1, and increasingly encircled as the battle wore into its final day, fought a fierce and costly rearguard action to extricate what remained of his army, an extraction made catastrophically worse when a nervous French engineer, misreading his orders amid the battle's chaos, blew a critical bridge over the Elster River prematurely, trapping tens of thousands of French soldiers, including one of Bonaparte's most storied marshals, the Polish Prince Józef Poniatowski, who drowned attempting to swim the river rather than surrender, on the wrong side of the water as the city fell. Leipzig cost Bonaparte, by the most careful estimates, something on the order of 70,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, and with it, in the weeks that followed, the whole of Germany, as the client states of the Confederation of the Rhine, sensing with a sudden and near universal clarity which way the continent's fortunes had finally turned, abandoned their French alliances one after another and joined the coalition against their former master. Bonaparte retreated back across the Rhine into France itself for the first time in over a decade. An emperor who had spent his entire adult reign fighting his wars on other people's soil, now facing for the first time the imminent prospect of an Allied invasion of France proper. And it is worth pausing here, briefly, to notice the strange and rather bitter symmetry of that moment, because the France of early 1814, exhausted by 2 decades of nearly continuous war, its population bled by conscription, that had, over the years, reached ever deeper into ever younger age cohorts, its economy strained by the collapsing remnants of the continental system, greeted the prospect of yet another campaign, this one fought at last upon its own soil, with a weariness that had begun to shade in significant and growing pockets of French society into something closer to relief at the thought that it might, at long last, be nearing its end. The campaign of France and the first abdication. What followed in the first months of 1814 was, by the near unanimous judgment of military historians who have studied it since, among the most tactically brilliant campaigns of Bonaparte's entire career, fought by a scratch, heavily outnumbered army against 3 separate advancing Allied forces converging on Paris from different directions, a campaign in which the Emperor, moving his exhausted, badly supplied troops with a speed and an economy of force that recalled, in flashes, the young general of Italy nearly 2 decades before, won a rapid succession of sharp local victories against isolated Allied columns that briefly and remarkably threw the coalition's entire advance into disarray and confusion. It was not enough. And by this stage of the war it could not have been enough, because the arithmetic that had always, in the end, governed Bonaparte's wars, the arithmetic of population and resources, and the sheer accumulated exhaustion of an empire that had been bleeding its young men into conscription for a generation, had finally turned decisively and irreversibly against him. Brilliant tactical victories against detachments of 10 or 20,000 men could not indefinitely hold back Allied armies that could, between them, field several 100,000, and the coalition's commanders, learning at last from years of bitter experience to simply bypass Bonaparte's own small, dangerous field army wherever possible and drive directly for Paris itself, reached the gates of the French capital at the end of March. Paris surrendered on the 30th of March 1814, its garrison too weak and its political leadership, led by the ever-adaptable Talleyrand, Bonaparte's own former foreign minister, who had, over the preceding years, quietly concluded that his emperor's cause was doomed, and had begun positioning himself to broker whatever settlement came next, unwilling to risk the destruction of the city in a hopeless defence. Bonaparte, racing back from the field, with what remained of his army in a desperate bid to relieve the capital, arrived too late, and in the days that followed, as Allied sovereigns entered Paris in a triumphal procession, and Talleyrand manoeuvred the French Senate into formally declaring Bonaparte deposed, his own marshals, exhausted after 2 decades of war, and increasingly convinced that further resistance could only prolong France's suffering without any realistic hope of altering the war's now settled outcome, refused, in a confrontation at the Palace of Fontainebleau, that Bonaparte himself found almost impossible to accept, to march the remaining army on Paris as he still, in these final days, wished to do. Isolated and confronted at last by the flat, unanimous refusal of the very marshals who had followed him across 2 decades of victories, Bonaparte abdicated unconditionally on the 6th of April 1814, and in the days immediately following, in a moment of despair that his own attending physicians later confirmed as genuine rather than theatrical, attempted to take his own life by poison, a dose he had carried with him since the retreat from Russia, a dose that had, through the passage of time, weakened sufficiently that it made him violently and prolongedly ill without killing him, and he survived. And in the negotiations that followed, the victorious allies, whose own sovereigns felt, in a gesture of aristocratic solidarity that would have been unthinkable toward almost any other defeated ruler in an age still capable of executing kings, a genuine reluctance to have the man treated as a common criminal, granted him, in the Treaty of Fontainebleau, an extraordinary and almost fantastical settlement. He would retain the title of emperor, be granted full sovereignty over the small Mediterranean island of Elba, off the coast of Tuscany, and receive a substantial annual pension from the restored French crown, an arrangement that struck a great many observers across Europe, then and since as a strangely generous consolation prize for a man who had, only months before, still commanded the fate of a continent. Elba. Bonaparte arrived on his small new island kingdom in May of 1814, 44 years old, ruling now not the tens of millions of subjects across a dozen nations he had commanded at his empire's height, but a population of some 10,000 islanders, and it says a great deal about the restless, compulsive nature of the man that even in this reduced and by any ordinary measure comfortable exile, he threw himself into the governance of his tiny new domain with much the same relentless energy he had once brought to the reorganization of France itself, reforming Elba's tax system, improving its roads and its agriculture, reorganizing its small militia, as though the scale of the task in front of him had never mattered nearly so much as the simple compulsive need to be reforming something. But the France he had left behind, restored now to the rule of the Bourbon dynasty in the person of the stout, gout-ridden King Louis XVIII, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, proved, across the 10 months of Bonaparte's confinement on Elba, unable to settle into the stable, reconciling peace that the exhausted nation had hoped for. The restored monarchy, staffed heavily by returning aristocratic émigrés who had spent the Revolution's decades in bitter exile, and who now pressed for the reversal of reforms that ordinary French citizens, and the army in particular, had come to regard as settled and irreversible achievements of the entire revolutionary and Napoleonic era, alienated broad sections of French society with unsettling speed, the army especially, its officer corps purged and its size sharply reduced, its veterans placed on half pay and watching with mounting resentment as returning royalist nobles, many of whom had spent the war years fighting against France in foreign uniforms, were given preferential treatment, nursed a bitterness that spread through garrison towns across the country, and that reached inevitably the ears of the deposed emperor watching from his small island less than a day's sail from the French coast, through a network of sympathetic visitors and smuggled correspondence that kept him closely informed of just how fragile the new settlement in Paris had already become. It is worth pausing here, before Bonaparte makes the decision that would define the last brief and most dramatic chapter of his active political life, to notice how narrow the historical window actually was that made his return even conceivable, because it depended on a very particular and very fragile alignment of circumstance. A restored monarchy that had squandered, with remarkable speed, the goodwill a war-weary nation had initially been prepared to extend it. An army whose loyalty to the old imperial cause and to the man personally had never actually been extinguished by a single defeat, however total that defeat had briefly seemed, and a Congress of Vienna, the grand diplomatic gathering where the victorious Allied powers were, through the winter of 1814 into 1815, laboriously redrawing the map of post-Napoleonic Europe, so absorbed in its own elaborate rounds of negotiation, celebration, and mutual suspicion among the victors themselves, Russia and Prussia disputing bitterly over the fate of Poland and Saxony, even as they congratulated themselves on Bonaparte's downfall, that its collective attention had drifted dangerously away from the small, watchful, and still formidably capable man waiting on his island a few dozen miles off the Italian coast, On the 26th of February 1815, judging his moment, Napoleon Bonaparte slipped past the small naval patrol meant to watch his island, boarded a brig with a little over 1,000 of his loyal Elban guard, and set sail for France to begin the final, astonishing 100-day chapter of a story that all of Europe had, only months before, allowed itself to believe was already finished. The 100 days. Bonaparte landed on the southern coast of France near Caen on the 1st of March 1815, with a force so small, barely more than 1,000 men, that the whole enterprise must have looked, to any sober observer, like an act of near-suicidal folly, a gesture rather than a genuine campaign, and the government in Paris, when word of the landing reached it, seems initially to have regarded it much the same way, dispatching troops confidently to intercept and arrest the returning emperor, as though dealing with a minor, easily contained disturbance. What followed instead was one of the most remarkable episodes of pure, unforced political theatre in the whole of this story, because as Bonaparte marched north through the French countryside, deliberately avoiding the more royalist-leaning regions in favour of a route through areas where his old veterans and the rural poor, still resentful of the returned nobility's privileges, were most likely to rally to him, the troops sent to stop him did not fire. At the town of Laffrey, south of Grenoble, Bonaparte, in a moment that has become one of the most celebrated set pieces of the entire Napoleonic legend, walked forward alone toward a royal battalion drawn up across the road with muskets raised, threw open his own coat and called out, by the account preserved and repeated ever since, that if any man among them wished to kill his emperor, here he stood, ready. And the soldiers, after a long, suspended, historically decisive moment of silence, broke their ranks not to fire, but to rush forward, shouting their old cry of loyalty, and joined him. It happened again, garrison after garrison, town after town, all the way to Paris, an army sent to arrest him simply dissolving into an army marching beside him, until King Louis XVIII, watching his own restored government's authority evaporate with a speed that stunned every court in Europe, fled the capital in the night, and on the 20th of March, not yet 3 weeks after wading ashore with barely 1,000 followers, Napoleon Bonaparte entered the Tuileries Palace in Paris once more as its master, without a single shot having been fired in his path across the whole length of France, a feat of pure, uncoerced popular and military momentum that even Bonaparte's fiercest enemies could not help but regard in its way as an extraordinary achievement, whatever they intended to do about it next. What they intended to do about it, the assembled sovereigns and ministers still gathered at the Congress of Vienna, was settled within days of the news reaching them. Rather than treat with the returned emperor at all, the Allied powers declared him an outlaw, placed beyond the protection of the law of nations, and resolved, with a unity and a speed that Bonaparte's return had, ironically, done more to forge among the fractious victors than almost anything else could have, to raise their armies once again and finish, this time completely and permanently, what the campaigns of 1814 had left unresolved. Bonaparte, for his part, spent the 100 days that followed his return not merely preparing for the war he knew was now inevitable, but attempting, with a genuine if ultimately doomed sincerity that surprised even some of his own oldest supporters, to present himself to France and to Europe as a changed and more moderate ruler, promising a new, more liberal constitution with a real, elected legislature and expanded civil liberties, an effort at reinvention that came, in the end, too late, and convinced too few of the sovereigns now mobilising against him to alter the war's fundamental terms. Waterloo. Rather than wait in France for the combined weight of the assembling coalition, Austrian and Russian armies still gathering strength on the far side of the Rhine, Bonaparte chose, with the same audacious instinct for the initiative that had defined his very first campaigns 2 decades before, to strike first and separately at the 2 Allied armies already positioned nearest to the French border, in modern-day Belgium. A British-led force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops under the Duke of Wellington, the same commander who had spent 6 grinding years wearing down French power in Spain, and a Prussian army under the tough, aggressive 72-year-old Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher, hoping, by defeating each in turn before they could unite their combined and considerably superior numbers against him, to shatter the coalition's momentum before it could fully gather. He crossed into Belgium on the 15th of June 1815, and in the 2 days that followed won a real if incomplete victory over Blücher's Prussians at the Battle of Ligny, driving them into a retreat that Bonaparte, in a decision that would prove fateful, believed had sent them withdrawing away from Wellington's army rather than, as actually happened, in a direction that kept the door open for the 2 Allied armies to reunite. A French detachment of some 30,000 men, sent under Marshal Grouchy to pursue and prevent exactly that Prussian reunion, would spend the crucial day that followed chasing a Prussian rearguard in the wrong direction entirely, missing the decisive battle of the entire campaign while it was actually being fought only a few hours' march away. That decisive battle came on the 18th of June, near a small village south of Brussels called Waterloo, where Wellington, having withdrawn his own army the previous day to a defensive ridge he had personally scouted months before, as a promising position should such a battle ever become necessary, drew up his roughly 68,000 men along a low rise, anchored on a scattering of stoutly built farmhouses and a walled chateau garden that would become, across the day's fighting, one of the most fiercely and repeatedly contested small patches of ground in the whole of European military history, and waited for Bonaparte's attack, trusting, on the strength of a promise from old Blücher himself, that the Prussian army, though badly mauled 2 days before, would march to join him before the day was out. Bonaparte, commanding a French army of roughly 72,000 men, delayed his opening assault that morning, by several accounts waiting for the sodden, rain-soaked ground from the previous night's storm to dry sufficiently to allow his artillery and cavalry to manoeuvre effectively, a delay of a few hours that history has argued over ever since, because those very hours gave the approaching Prussian army just enough additional time to draw nearer to the battlefield. The fighting that followed unfolded across a long, brutal and repeatedly indecisive day. A French assault on the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont on Wellington's right flank, intended partly as a diversion, drew in far more French troops and far more of the day's fighting than Bonaparte had planned, without ever actually capturing the position, its small garrison of British and Allied troops holding grimly on behind its walls for the entire battle. A massive infantry assault against Wellington's centre in the early afternoon was broken by a devastating British and Allied cavalry countercharge that shattered the advancing French columns, but then, in the overconfidence and momentum of its own success, rode too far and too recklessly into the heart of the French position, and was, in turn, cut to pieces by French cavalry and artillery once its own horses had blown themselves out. A series of massed French cavalry charges against the British infantry squares in the battle's middle hours, some of the most spectacular and most costly cavalry actions in the whole of the Napoleonic Wars, broke again and again against infantry that held its disciplined hollow squares under a hail of fire and steel, with a steadiness that has been studied and admired by military historians for 2 centuries since. And throughout the afternoon, as this brutal seesaw of attack and counter-attack ground on across the ridge, the sound of gunfire steadily growing on the French right flank told Bonaparte, with a dread that his own marshals could see settling over him as the hours passed, that Blücher's Prussians, defying Marshal Grouchy's entire pursuing detachment, were indeed arriving on the battlefield, exactly as Wellington had trusted they would. In the early evening, with the Prussians now committing significant forces against his exposed flank and rear, Bonaparte gambled everything on one final assault, sending forward his Imperial Guard, the elite, veteran core of his entire army, men who had never in the whole of Bonaparte's career been defeated in a decisive attack, in a last attempt to break Wellington's weakened but still unbroken centre before the arriving Prussians could seal the battle beyond any recovery. Wellington's men, reinforced at the critical moment and holding a slightly reverse slope position that had sheltered them from the worst of the day's artillery fire, met the advancing guard with a devastating close-range volley that stopped the legendary formation in its tracks and then broke it, sending the Imperial Guard, for the first and only time in its entire history, reeling back in retreat, and the cry that swept through the rest of the French army at the sight, "La garde recule, the guard is falling back," broke what remained of French morale as completely and as suddenly as the volley itself had broken the guard's own ranks. Wellington, sensing the moment, ordered his entire line forward in a general advance, and the French army, already buckling under the converging weight of the arriving Prussians on its flank, collapsed into a full and increasingly disorderly rout as the light began to fail on that long June evening. Bonaparte himself, according to several accounts, attempted to rally the remnants of the Guard for one final, hopeless stand before being persuaded by his own officers to leave the field, and by nightfall, the army that had marched into Belgium 4 days before with such confident momentum had ceased, in any meaningful military sense, to exist. The casualties of that single day, by the most careful modern estimates, ran to somewhere in the region of 25,000 French dead and wounded, and a broadly comparable number among Wellington's and Blucher's combined forces, close to 50,000 men in total, killed or maimed in roughly 9 hours of fighting across a battlefield only a few miles wide, a concentration of violence that even veterans of Borodino and Leipzig found difficult, in the days afterward, to fully absorb. Bonaparte fled south toward Paris in the battle's immediate aftermath, arriving to find, once again as in 1814, a political establishment no longer willing to fight on his behalf. The French legislature, unwilling to see the capital and the country subjected to yet another invasion on his account, refused to rally behind him, and on the 22nd of June 1815, barely 100 days after slipping ashore near Cannes with 1,000 men and a coat he was willing to open to a firing squad, Napoleon Bonaparte abdicated for the second and final time. He surrendered himself, weeks later, to the captain of a British warship, HMS Bellerophon, hoping, by some accounts, for permission to retire quietly to a country estate in England, or perhaps to the United States, a hope the British government, having fought this one man's ambitions for the better part of 20 years, at a cost in blood and treasure, it had no intention of risking a third time, had absolutely no intention of granting him, the bravest of the brave. Before we follow Bonaparte himself out onto the ocean, it is worth pausing on the fate of the men he left behind in France, because the reckoning that followed the Second Bourbon Restoration fell hardest not on the Emperor, who at least escaped to a foreign exile with his life and his dignity largely intact, but on the officers who had rallied to him during the 100 Days, and it is worth telling in some detail the story of one of them, because it stands, better than almost any other single episode in this whole night's story, as a kind of microcosm of everything this era asked of the men who served it, and everything it was willing to do to them once their usefulness had ended. Marshal Michel Ney had been, across nearly the whole span of the wars this night has walked you through, one of Bonaparte's most consistently brave and consistently reckless field commanders, a blacksmith's son from Lorraine who had risen, exactly as the meritocratic promise of the Revolutionary Army suggested he might, from the ranks to a marshal's baton, who had commanded the desperate, exhausting rearguard that kept the retreat from Russia from becoming a total annihilation, personally by several accounts, one of the very last French soldiers to recross the Niemen musket in hand, and who had earned from Bonaparte's own lips the title by which history remembers him still, Le Brave des Braves, the bravest of the brave. When Bonaparte escaped Elba in 1815, Ney, who had sworn loyalty to the restored Bourbon king and had initially promised to bring his former emperor back to Paris in an iron cage, found himself, within days of actually encountering his old commander on the road north, unable to keep that promise, and threw in his lot with Bonaparte once again, commanding at Waterloo some of the war's most desperate and most costly cavalry charges, with a raw physical courage that several eyewitnesses described as bordering on a deliberate, exhausted search for death on the battlefield itself. 5 horses shot from under him that single day, his uniform torn and blackened by powder, still leading charge after charge into a defence that would not break. It did not save him. Captured after the Second Restoration, Ney was tried for treason before the very peers of France who had, only months before, sworn their own oaths of loyalty to the emperor he had rejoined, and was condemned to death. And on the 7th of December 1815, he was executed by firing squad in a quiet garden in Paris, refusing in his final moments the blindfold traditionally offered to condemned men, and giving the order to fire himself, a final, defiant act of soldierly command aimed, this last time, at his own death, rather than at any enemy's. It is worth sitting with Ney's story for a moment because it captures, in one single life, both halves of everything this whole night has tried to hold together honestly. The genuine, extraordinary upward mobility that the revolutionary and Napoleonic era made possible for a blacksmith's son who would, in any earlier generation of French history, have had no conceivable path to a marshal's rank at all, and the equally genuine, equally extraordinary brutality of an age that discarded the very men who had built an empire's victories the moment the political winds shifted against them, an age in which courage of the kind Ney showed at Waterloo, 5 horses killed beneath him in a battle he must have known by its final hour was already lost, could still, within 6 months, be answered with a firing squad in a garden. He was not alone. Across France, in the months of the so-called White Terror that followed the Second Restoration, hundreds of former Bonapartist officials and officers were purged from their posts, imprisoned, or, in a smaller number of prominent cases, executed, a quieter and less thoroughly remembered violence than the great battles this night has spent so much of its time on, but a real one, and one that fell, as this kind of political reckoning nearly always does, disproportionately on men who had risen from modest origins and had no great family name or fortune to shield them once their emperor's protection had vanished. The peace that redrew the map. While Ney and men like him faced their reckonings in France, the victorious Allied powers were completing, at the Congress of Vienna, the long and elaborate work of redrawing the map of Europe that Bonaparte's escape from Elba had briefly interrupted, and it is worth spending a little time on what that settlement actually did, because the Europe it created would shape the continent's politics for the following century, and because it tells us something important about what the great powers had actually learned, and had not learned, from 2 decades of revolutionary and Napoleonic upheaval, guided above all by the patient, conservative diplomacy of Austria's Metternich, working alongside representatives of Britain, Russia and Prussia, and, in a remarkable act of pragmatic statecraft, allowing France itself, represented by the endlessly adaptable Talleyrand, a real seat at the table, despite having so recently been the continent's common enemy the Congress pursued above all else, a settlement designed to prevent any single power, and above all any resurgent France, from ever again threatening to dominate the whole continent by force, redrawing borders with a deliberate eye toward balance rather than toward the national aspirations of the peoples living inside those borders, restoring a chastened Bourbon monarchy in Paris, but declining to punish France itself with any of the harsh, humiliating territorial losses that a more vengeful peace might have imposed, on the calculated theory that a stable, moderately treated France was less dangerous in the long run than a resentful, humiliated one, nursing a grievance the way defeated nations so often and so dangerously do. It was, by the narrow measure the great powers set for it, a genuinely successful peace, ushering in nearly 4 decades without another general war among the major powers of Europe, a stretch of relative peace long enough that it is sometimes called, by historians who study exactly this kind of thing, the concert of Europe, a system of periodic diplomatic consultation among the great powers intended to manage future crises before they could spiral into the kind of continent-wide conflagration this whole night has just walked you through. But it was also, and this deserves to be said plainly, a settlement built almost entirely around the interests and the comfort of crowned monarchs and their foreign ministers, with only the barest, most incidental regard for the national aspirations that Bonaparte's own conquests had so powerfully, if unintentionally, awakened among the Germans and the Italians and the Poles, whose hopes for unification or independence were, in nearly every case, set firmly aside in favour of restoring, as closely as the intervening chaos allowed, the older, more manageable patchwork of small states and dynastic rule that had existed before the revolution first tore it apart. Poland, whose people had fought for Bonaparte with a devotion born of genuine hope for their nation's restoration, was carved up once again among Russia, Prussia and Austria, very nearly as it had been before Bonaparte's brief Grand Duchy of Warsaw offered it a taste of independent existence, a betrayal of Polish hopes that would smoulder and periodically erupt into open rebellion for the whole of the following century. It is worth marking that irony one final time before we let it go, because it is the same irony this whole night has kept circling back to. The nationalist and liberal ideas Bonaparte's conquests spread across Europe, however cynically or incompletely he himself ever actually believed in them, proved far more durable in the end than the empire that had carried them, and the settlement built by the very kings who had defeated him would spend the following century being slowly, unevenly, and often violently unravelled by exactly the forces his invasions had first set loose. What became of the others? It is worth taking a moment too for the wider circle of men whose names have moved through this whole long story alongside Bonaparte's own, because their scattered fates, taken together, tell us something about just how completely this particular emperor's fortunes had become entangled with the fortunes of everyone who had ever attached themselves to him. Joachim Murat, the dashing cavalry commander we first met galloping across revolutionary Paris to seize artillery before dawn, and who had gone on to marry Bonaparte's own sister Caroline and be crowned King of Naples, gambled, in the chaotic months of 1815, on trying to preserve his own throne by declaring war on Austria in a bid to rally Italian nationalist sentiment to his cause, independently of his brother-in-law's own campaign. A gamble that failed completely. Stripped of his kingdom, he attempted, that October, a hopeless, almost theatrical bid to reclaim it by the landing with a tiny band of followers on the Calabrian coast, was captured within days, and was executed by firing squad, meeting his own death, by every account that survives, with the same flamboyant theatrical courage that had defined his entire remarkable career, reportedly directing the firing squad himself, and refusing a blindfold, dying as he had lived, with a flourish. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, the Gascon lawyer's son who had risen through the revolutionary army to become a marshal, and had then been improbably elected, in 1810, heir to the childless King of Sweden, made the opposite gamble, and made it successfully, turning against his old comrade entirely once the Swedish crown's own interests pointed the other way, fighting against Bonaparte in the coalition that won at Leipzig, and living out a long, secure reign as King Charles XIV John of Sweden, his descendant sitting on the Swedish throne to this very day, an entire European royal house descended, however improbably, from a provincial French lawyer's son who once served as one of Bonaparte's own generals. Talleyrand, the endlessly adaptable diplomat who had served, in one capacity or another, the Ancien Régime, the Revolution, Bonaparte's own consulate and empire, and finally the restored Bourbon monarchy, each time reading with uncanny precision exactly when to abandon a failing cause and exactly how to make himself indispensable to whatever came next, died in his bed in 1838 at the age of 84, having outlived nearly every other figure in this story, and having secured, through sheer unsentimental political survival instinct, a more comfortable and a very much longer old age than almost any of the soldiers whose battles this whole night has described. and Marie-Louise, the young Austrian Archduchess married to Bonaparte in 1810 to secure an alliance that lasted barely 2 years before her own father's empire rejoined the coalition against her husband, left France for good after his first abdication, taking their young son with her, and settled into a comfortable, largely untroubled life as Duchess of Parma, remarrying and by most accounts showing rather less interest in her first husband's subsequent fate than the more romantic tellings of this story sometimes prefer to suggest. A small deflating footnote that belongs, honestly, alongside everything else. This knight has tried to tell you plainly rather than romantically. Their son, the King of Rome that Bonaparte had wanted so desperately, grew up in the Austrian court under the title Duke of Reichstadt, watched carefully and kept well away from any political influence by the very grandfather whose empire his own father had once humbled, and died there of tuberculosis in 1832 at only 21 years old, the direct Bonaparte line through which the emperor had once hoped to found a lasting dynasty extinguished within a single generation of the empire itself, St. Helena. The place the British government chose instead, after some weeks of anxious deliberation about how to permanently neutralise a man who had already once slipped free of an island a great deal closer to the mainland of Europe, was about as remote and as final an answer to that anxiety as the surface of the earth could offer. A small volcanic island called St. Helena, barely 10 miles across, standing alone in the South Atlantic Ocean, more than 1,000 miles from the nearest coast of Africa, and nearly 2,000 miles from South America, a place so isolated that a ship sailing from Europe took upward of 2 months simply to reach it, and so bare and windswept in its interior highlands that even Bonaparte's own attendants, arriving with him in October of 1815 to share his final exile, found the climate damp, chilly, and relentlessly depressing after the warmth of the Mediterranean world he had spent his whole life moving through. He was housed at a residence called Longwood House, a low, draughty, poorly built structure plagued by damp and by rats, watched over day and night by a garrison of British troops and by a governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, whose relationship with his famous prisoner soured, almost from the outset, into a bitter, petty, mutually exhausting war of wills, Lowe enforcing an ever-tightening set of restrictions on Bonaparte's movements and correspondence out of a genuine, if increasingly obsessive, fear of another escape, and Bonaparte, in turn, retreating for long stretches into a wounded theatrical seclusion, refusing at times to see the governor at all, cultivating with the same instinctive genius for self-presentation that had once filled his military bulletins, the image of a great, wronged, unjustly persecuted man, an image he understood with characteristic shrewdness even in these final powerless years would matter enormously to how history remembered him. It was on that isolated, wind-scoured rock, across nearly 6 years of exile, that Napoleon Bonaparte performed the last great act of his extraordinary life, and it was not a battle at all, but an act of memory and narration, because it was here, dictating for hours at a stretch, to a small, devoted circle of followers who had chosen to share his exile, that he set about the deliberate, patient construction of the legend that would carry his name forward long after his actual power had become nothing more than a memory confined to a few damp rooms on a distant island. Chief among those followers was a former naval officer and count named Emmanuel de las Cases, who recorded, across many months of conversation, Bonaparte's own account of his life, his wars, and his motives, later published, after Bonaparte's death, as the Memorial of St. Helena, a work that became, almost immediately upon its release, one of the most influential and widely read books in 19th century Europe, shaping the popular image of Napoleon for generations of readers who encountered, in its pages, not the calculating, sometimes ruthless architect of conquest. This whole night's story has tried to show you honestly in full, but a humane, visionary reformer, a champion of the common man against the privileged old order of kings, a bringer of liberty and legal equality, who had been driven to war again and again only by the unyielding hostility of Europe's reactionary monarchies, and who had wanted, all along, nothing more than to see the ideals of the revolution spread and secured across a continent that had refused, out of fear and privilege, to accept them peacefully. It is worth pausing here, honestly, on the strange and genuinely important fact that the version of Napoleon Bonaparte most deeply embedded in European popular memory for the 2 centuries since, the romantic, tragic, visionary figure, was substantially the invention of the man himself, composed in his final years with the same deliberate, image-conscious skill he had once brought to a military bulletin written the morning after a battle, and that generations of historians since have had to work, carefully and sceptically, to separate the calculated self-portrait from the considerably more complicated man underneath it, a man who had, as we have spent this whole night tracing honestly together, ordered the massacre of surrendered prisoners at Jaffa, reintroduced slavery into the French colonies for reasons of cold economic calculation, manipulated plebiscite after plebiscite to manufacture the appearance of popular consent for his own accumulating personal power, and spent the lives of hundreds of thousands upon hundreds of thousands of ordinary conscripted soldiers across 2 decades of nearly continuous war in pursuit of an empire whose ultimate purpose, stripped of its own most flattering rhetoric, was very often simply the further consolidation of his own dynasty's power and his own personal, unappeasable sense that he was owed, by history itself, a place among its very greatest names. Both the Las Casas portrait and the harsher one sit, uncomfortably but genuinely side by side in the same man, and a story told honestly in the dark tonight owes you that discomfort rather than the tidier version either his admirers or his enemies have, at various points across 2 centuries, preferred to tell. He died at Longwood on the 5th of May 1821 at the age of 51, after a slow decline through the final months of illness whose precise cause has been argued over for 2 centuries since, the doctors who attended him at the time diagnosing stomach cancer, the same disease that had killed his own father at almost exactly the same age. A diagnosis that most modern medical historians, reviewing the original autopsy notes, still consider the most likely explanation, though a persistent and colourful theory, based on later chemical analysis of preserved samples of his hair, showing elevated arsenic levels, has argued that he was slowly poisoned, whether deliberately by a political enemy or accidentally by arsenic-laced wallpaper dye and medicines common enough in the period, a theory the great majority of careful historians regard as intriguing, but ultimately unproven and most probably mistaken. The elevated arsenic levels explainable by substances common enough in ordinary 19th century households that similar levels turn up in hair samples from that era, belonging to people who plainly were never poisoned at all. It is worth setting that mystery down honestly, neither dismissed nor oversold, exactly where it belongs among the many things about this extraordinary life that we can describe with confidence, and the handful of things we simply cannot and cannot ever fully resolve. His last words, as recorded by those at his bedside, are said to have included amid the wandering fragments of a dying man's delirium the words France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine, a fittingly compressed final summary, whether entirely accurate in its details or lightly smoothed by the same myth-making impulse that shaped so much else about how this story has come down to us, of the handful of things that had organised the whole of an extraordinary and terrible life. He was buried on the island itself, in a quiet valley he had specifically chosen, beneath a willow tree, and it was not until 1840, 19 years later, under a French government eager by then to reclaim and celebrate the Napoleonic legend for its own political purposes, that his remains were exhumed, carried home across the ocean he had once tried and failed to command, and interred, with an elaborate state ceremony attended by immense, adoring Parisian crowds, beneath the dome of the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, where they remain to this day, visited still by hundreds of thousands of people every single year. Nobody counted, and so nobody knows. before we let the last of this story's dust settle and turn, as this channel always tries to turn, from the sweep of the events themselves toward the quieter question of what they actually cost the people who lived and died inside them, it is worth attempting honestly and without flinching the accounting that Bonaparte's own bulletins were always so careful never to complete. Historians who have spent entire careers trying to total the human cost of the wars that carried this one man's name across a continent, from the first campaigns of the revolution he inherited through the final volley at Waterloo, have arrived, after generations of careful archival work, at figures that still vary considerably depending on which years and whose dead are counted, but that converge across the most careful modern estimates on a range somewhere between 3 and 6 million deaths, soldiers and civilians together, French and Allied and enemy alike, spread across every corner of a continent that had, before this quarter-century of war began, imagined itself the most civilized in the history of the world. It is worth sitting with the width of that range for a moment, 3 million at the low end and 6 million at the high, because the very breadth of the uncertainty tells you something important all on its own. That so much of this dying happened in places and in circumstances that nobody at the time thought worth carefully recording, in the ditches beside the road out of Moscow, in villages burned by requisitioning armies whose officers filed no report on the peasant families left with nothing to eat that winter, in the slow, unglamorous deaths of disease and malnutrition that trailed every one of these campaigns like a shadow, and that killed, across the whole sweep of the era, considerably more soldiers than any single battlefield ever did, a statistic true of nearly every war fought before the 20th century, and one that Bonaparte's own glittering bulletins, understandably enough for a man building a legend, essentially never mentioned at all. Consider for just a moment what that toll actually meant at the level of a single village, a single family, because the aggregate number, staggering as it is, has a way of going numb in the mind precisely because it is so large, and the numbness is itself a kind of forgetting we ought to resist. Across the length and breadth of the French Empire and its client states, conscription reached, in the war's later and more desperate years, boys as young as 16 or 17, called up years ahead of the terms that had governed earlier drafts, so that entire villages across rural France and the annexed departments of Belgium and the Rhineland and northern Italy found themselves systematically emptied year after year of a whole generation of young men, a demographic wound that shows up still if you know how to look for it, in the population records and the family genealogies of European villages a full 2 centuries later, a gap in the family tree where a young man's marriage and children should have been recorded and were not, because he had died, unnamed in any bulletin, somewhere on a road or a battlefield whose name his own family in many cases never learned with any certainty. This was the true and truly enormous price of the extraordinary campaigns this whole night has walked you through, and it is a price that fell overwhelmingly and by a margin that deserves to be named plainly, on people who had no vote in whether the wars were fought at all, on the sons of peasants and labourers and small tradesmen, called up by a system of conscription that the wealthy, again and again across these decades, found perfectly legal and perfectly respectable ways to avoid, whether through the purchase of an exemption where such purchases were permitted, or through the simple structural advantage of sons educated and connected enough to secure a safer post on a headquarters staff rather than a place in the front rank of an infantry column marching into Russia. Whose ledger and whose crown? It is worth pausing here on the particular and rather stark unfairness of who rose and who paid across the whole sweep of this story, because Bonaparte's empire liked to present itself, and in certain real respect genuinely was, a meritocracy unlike anything the old dynastic order of Europe had ever permitted, a system in which a baker's son or a lawyer's clerk could, through genuine ability and genuine battlefield courage, rise to command an army corps, to be made a Marshal of France, to be granted a title, an estate, sometimes an entire foreign kingdom to govern, as happened across these years to men like Joachim Murat once an innkeeper's son from the south of France who ended his career as King of Naples, or Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, a lawyer's son from Gascony who rose through the revolutionary army to become, by the strange accidents of dynastic politics in these turbulent years, King of Sweden, a title his own descendants hold to this very day. That upward mobility was real, and it mattered enormously to the men who achieved it, and it stood, without question, in genuine and meaningful contrast to the rigid, birth-determined hierarchies of the old European monarchies this whole story has watched Bonaparte defeat again and again. But it is worth holding, in the same breath, the considerably less inspiring truth that sits directly beneath that meritocratic promise, which is that for every baker's son who became a marshal, tens of thousands of other men's sons, no less capable, no less brave, simply died, unpromoted and unremembered, in the ranks where the accident of survival rather than any particular deficiency of merit had placed them, and that the glittering court Bonaparte assembled around his new imperial nobility, his marshals and dukes and princes with their palaces and their pensions and their captured Italian paintings on the walls, was built, in the most literal and most uncomfortable sense, upon a foundation of conscripted peasant labour and conscripted peasant blood that the new imperial aristocracy, whatever its own humble origins a decade or two before, showed very little more interest in questioning than the old aristocracy it had replaced ever had. And it is worth holding, too, in that same two-handed way this channel always tries to hold its history, the plain fact that the language of liberty and equality that justified so much of Bonaparte's conquest, the promise, carried by his armies into Italy and Germany and Poland, of an end to feudal privilege and the introduction of equal citizenship under a rational modern legal code, sat very uneasily beside the reintroduction of chattel slavery in the French Caribbean colonies in 1802, a policy decision made, as we noted earlier this night, for reasons of cold commercial calculation, rather than any coherent ideological principle, and one that fell with the most brutal and most direct force imaginable upon several 100,000 enslaved men, women and children in Saint-Domingue and Martinique and Guadeloupe, whose own freedom, briefly and imperfectly won during the Revolution's more radical years, Bonaparte's own government moved, with a chilling and entirely deliberate efficiency, to take back by force. The people of Saint-Domingue, under the extraordinary leadership first of Toussaint Louverture, seized and shipped to a French prison where he died in 1803, and then of his successors, fought that reimposition of slavery to a standstill and ultimately to a total, historic victory, defeating the French expeditionary force sent to subdue them, and, in January of 1804, the very same month and year in which Bonaparte was crowning himself emperor in Notre Dame, declaring the independent nation of Haiti, the first nation in the history of the modern world to be founded by a successful uprising of the enslaved against their enslavers. It is a story that deserves to be told far more fully and far more often than it usually is in the popular telling of this era, and it belongs, honestly and without qualification, inside any account of Napoleon Bonaparte's empire that claims to tell the whole of it, because it shows us, as clearly as any single episode in this entire long night can, that the empire's own proclaimed ideals of liberty and equality were never in practice, extended equally to everyone living inside its reach, and that some of the very people Bonaparte's empire tried hardest to subjugate were also, in the end, among the very few to defeat it completely and permanently, rather than merely, as every European power eventually did, to outlast it. The voices in the ranks, history, told at the scale this whole night has necessarily told it, in emperors and marshals and the great hinge battles that move the borders of nations, has a way of losing the ordinary human voice entirely, and it is worth pausing, before we begin to draw all these threads back together, to let a few of those ordinary voices speak, in the small fragments that have survived, because they tell us things the bulletins and the treaties never could. Soldiers' letters home, thousands of which survive in French archives and in the private collections of families across Europe, carry a very different register from the confident, glorious language of Bonaparte's own official proclamations, a register of homesickness and hunger and a kind of weary, matter-of-fact endurance that reads, across 2 centuries, as startlingly modern and startlingly familiar. A young conscript writing home from the Spanish front might describe, in a single unpunctuated paragraph, the beauty of a mountain sunrise and the terror of an ambush by guerrillas the night before, and an anxious question about whether his mother's cow had recovered from its illness, all 3 concerns sitting, with the peculiar flatness that exhaustion produces side by side on the same page, because a soldier far from home does not experience his own war as a single coherent narrative, building toward a decisive battle. He experiences it as a string of ordinary exhausting days interrupted unpredictably by terror, and the letters that survive remind us more honestly than any general's memoir that this is what the Napoleonic Wars actually were. For the overwhelming majority of the men who fought in them, not a series of Austerlitzes, but years of marching and waiting and hunger and boredom and homesickness, punctuated by comparatively brief and comparatively rare episodes of the kind of violence the history books remember. Consider, too, the women whose lives this story has so far left almost entirely in the margins, not because their experience mattered less, but because the sources that survive were, overwhelmingly, written by and about men, a bias this channel tries, wherever it honestly can, to correct rather than simply repeat. There were the wives and mothers left behind in French and German and Italian and Polish villages, managing farms and workshops and households alone for years, at a stretch while husbands and sons marched off to wars whose outcomes they learned about, if they learned about them at all, weeks or months after the fact, from official notices or from the halting, incomplete testimony of a wounded neighbour's son who had made it home when their own had not. There were the vivandières and cantinières, women who travelled with the armies themselves, selling food and drink and tending the wounded, whose presence on nearly every one of these campaigns, from Italy through the retreat from Russia, was so ordinary and so essential to how these armies actually functioned day to day, that their near total absence from the grand paintings and the grand narratives of Napoleonic glory tells you a great deal about which kinds of contribution to a war get remembered and celebrated, and which kinds, however indispensable, simply do not. And there were, in occupied territories from Spain to Poland to the German states, an untold and uncountable number of women who suffered the particular, specific violence that occupying armies have inflicted upon civilian populations across every century of recorded warfare, a violence that appears, when it appears at all in the official records of this era, only in scattered fragments, in a general's private complaint about the ill discipline of his own troops, in a parish register's brief and euphemistic note, in the harrowing, unflinching etchings Goya made of a war he had personally witnessed in Spain, and that deserves, even in its fragmentary survival, to be named honestly here rather than passed over in respectful silence, because a silence of that kind is its own quiet form of forgetting. The woman crowned and set aside, it is worth returning now to Josephine, whom we left rather quickly at the start of this long night, married in haste to an obscure young general on his way to take command of a ragged army in Nice, because her own life, followed a little more closely, turns out to be one of those single biographies that seem to gather up, almost by accident, the whole shape of the larger era around them. She was born Marie-Joseph Rose Taché de la Pagerie in 1763 on the French Caribbean island of Martinique, the daughter of a modest, debt-burdened sugar planter, and she arrived in France as a teenager for an arranged marriage to a young aristocrat named Alexandre de Beauharnais, a marriage that gave her 2 children and very little happiness, the couple separating within a few years amid her husband's open infidelities. She was, by the time the revolution reached its most violent phase in 1794, a Parisian society woman in her 30s, estranged from a husband who had, by then, risen to a general's command in the Revolutionary Army himself, and it was that very husband's position and the suspicion of insufficient revolutionary zeal that clung to aristocratic generals during the panicked, denouncing atmosphere of the terror that led to his arrest and in July of 1794 his execution by guillotine, a fate Josephine herself narrowly escaped only because Robespierre's own fall from power and execution came just days after her own arrest, freeing her from a Parisian prison where she had, by her own later account, fully expected to die. Sit with that for a moment, because it is worth doing so. The woman who would one day be crowned Empress of the French by her own husband's hands in the candlelit splendour of Notre Dame had, only 10 years before that coronation, been a widow of the guillotine, held in a cell to await what she had every reason to believe would be her own turn beneath the blade, saved by a margin of days rather than years. It is precisely this kind of violent, vertiginous reversal of fortune, sudden ruin followed by sudden and even more startling elevation, that the revolutionary and Napoleonic era visited upon an extraordinary number of ordinary lives, and Josephine's own path from prison cell to imperial throne, however much more comfortable its later stages became than most, captures something true about just how completely the old settled rules of who rose and who fell had been thrown into the air by the events this whole night has traced. She met the young General Bonaparte in the relieved, pleasure-seeking social world that followed the Terror's end, 6 years his senior, worldly and self-possessed in ways the awkward, provincial young officer plainly found intoxicating, and their marriage, whatever cooler calculation may have sat behind her own side of it in those early months, seems, across the years that followed, to have deepened into something genuinely and mutually important to both of them, weathering his long absences on campaign, weathering, too, infidelities on both sides that neither found easy to forgive, weathering the strange, unprecedented pressures of a marriage that had to accommodate, alongside its ordinary human joys and grievances, the steadily rising, steadily more suffocating weight of an empire being built around it. What it could not weather, in the end, was the absence of a child, and it is worth naming plainly, one final time, the particular cruelty of what that absence cost her, because Josephine's failure to bear Bonaparte an heir, a failure medical historians have since suggested, may have owed as much to complications from her own difficult first marriage and childbirths as to anything about the marriage to Bonaparte itself, was treated by the cold dynastic logic of an empire built entirely around the survival of one man's bloodline, as a problem to be solved rather than a grief to be shared, and solved it eventually was, in the divorce of 1809 that both parties, by every credible account, genuinely mourned even as both understood it as a political necessity neither felt able to resist. She retired to the Chateau of Malmaison outside Paris, where she had, across the years of her marriage, cultivated one of Europe's most celebrated botanical gardens and rose collections, corresponding with Bonaparte in letters that retained real warmth until the very end of her life, and she died there in 1814, in the same tumultuous spring that saw her former husband's first abdication, having lived just long enough to see the empire she had once been crowned to share come apart, though not long enough to see him exiled to Elba, or to see him return for the 100 Days, or to see the final defeat at Waterloo that closed the story she herself had, in her own quiet way, helped set in motion on that hopeful spring day in 1796, when a penniless young general rode south to Nice, with her name freshly written into his heart, alongside his orders. Bonaparte himself, dying on St. Helena 7 years later, is recorded by his attendants as having spoken her name among his very last words, a small human detail that sits, appropriately enough, outside the reach of any battle or any treaty this whole night has described, and that reminds us gently that even the men who reshape the map of a continent remain, underneath the crowns and the bulletins, simply people, capable of loving and losing and grieving in exactly the ordinary ways the rest of us do. How do we know what we know? It is worth pausing too on the rather peculiar question of how a story like this one, spanning a continent and 2 full decades and touching the lives of tens of millions of people, actually reaches us at all, because the answer tells you something important about how carefully any single piece of it needs to be handled. A great deal of what we know about Napoleon Bonaparte's own thinking, his motives, his private doubts and calculations, comes down to us filtered through sources that were never neutral to begin with. His own bulletins, written and edited for public consumption, with his personal legend always at least partly in mind. the memoirs of his marshals and secretaries, many of them written decades after the events they describe and coloured, understandably enough, by the particular political climate of whatever later regime the author happened to be writing under. A climate that made either fond nostalgia for the emperor or careful, self-protective distance from him more prudent depending on the decade, and towering over nearly everything else in terms of its influence on popular memory, the memorial of St. Helena we spoke of earlier this night, dictated by a defeated, powerless, but still extraordinarily persuasive man with every incentive in the world to shape how he would be remembered, and every bit of the rhetorical skill required to do exactly that. Modern historians have spent the better part of 2 centuries doing the patient, unglamorous work of cross-referencing these self-interested sources against military archives, financial records, diplomatic correspondence between other European courts who had no particular stake in flattering Bonaparte's legend, and the private letters and journals of ordinary soldiers and civilians who never expected their words to be read by anyone beyond the person they were writing to. And it is from that patient, cross-referenced, endlessly argued over body of work, rather than from any single dramatic source, that the honest, complicated portrait this whole night has tried to offer you actually comes. Where the record is thin, and it is thin in exactly the places you would expect, the deaths on the retreat from Russia that nobody was in a position to carefully count, the private thoughts of a dying emperor whose own last words were recorded by grieving and devoted witnesses with every emotional incentive to remember them in the most poignant possible light. This channel has tried to tell you so plainly, rather than paper over the gaps with a false and comfortable certainty, the empire that never quite ended. It is worth pausing now on a strange and rather quiet truth about this whole enormous story, which is that the empire itself, as a set of borders on a map, collapsed completely and permanently in the summer of 1815, and yet a surprising amount of what that empire actually built has never, in any meaningful sense, gone away at all, so that pieces of Napoleon Bonaparte's 20 years of conquest are sitting this very evening closer to you than you might expect. The Napoleonic Code, drafted in those intense consulate years we spent time with earlier tonight, remains in its lineal descendants, the foundation of the civil law systems still in daily use across France and Belgium and the Netherlands and much of Italy and Spain and Portugal and Poland, and carried by colonisation and by simple intellectual prestige far beyond the borders Bonaparte's own armies ever reached, in Egypt, in Louisiana, in Quebec, across large stretches of Latin America, so that a property dispute settled in a courtroom in Cairo or a family inheritance divided in Montreal today is being resolved, however many layers of subsequent amendments sit on top of it. According to legal principles a Corsican general once helped draft by candlelight 200 years ago. The metric system, adopted and standardised during those same revolutionary and Napoleonic years and spread, as so much else was, along the marching routes of the Grande Armée into the territories it occupied, is now the measurement system of nearly every nation on earth. A piece of quiet, unglamorous, thoroughly bureaucratic legacy, considerably more durable in its daily practical reach into billions of ordinary lives than any battle this whole night has described. Walk the streets of Paris today, and Bonaparte's presence is everywhere in stone. The Arc de Triomphe, which he commissioned to honour his armies and which was not actually completed until years after his death, still dominates the western skyline of the city. The Vendôme column, cast in a detail dripping with characteristic imperial theatre from the melted-down bronze of cannons captured at Austerlitz, still stands with his statue at its summit. Torn down once by the radical Paris Commune of 1871 and rebuilt again afterward, the Louvre, whose collection swelled so dramatically with paintings and sculptures seized from Italy and elsewhere during his campaigns, most of it returned to its original owners in the years immediately following his final defeat, but not, as a matter of honest record, all of it, still bears the shape of an institution his conquests helped fill. and the borders and national identities of the Europe that he fought across still carry, if you know how to trace them, the marks of what his invasions unintentionally set loose. The very idea of Germany and of Italy as unified nations, rather than as the scattered patchworks of small kingdoms and principalities they had been for centuries before Bonaparte's armies marched through and, in doing so, showed their populations both the humiliation of foreign occupation and the electrifying example of what a unified nation mobilised behind a single idea could accomplish, gathered real momentum in exactly the resentful reactive nationalism his own conquest provoked. A nationalism that would, within 2 generations of his death, produce the unified German and Italian states of the later 19th century. States whose own subsequent history in the century that followed would in turn reshape the entire world in ways this particular emperor, however grand his own sense of his place in history, could scarcely have imagined. It is worth pausing too on the odder and more unexpected inheritances this era left behind, the small, practical, almost invisible pieces of daily life that trace back, if you follow the thread far enough, to the particular pressures of feeding and treating and moving an army the size of the ones this whole night has described. Faced with the challenge of provisioning troops on campaigns that ranged farther and lasted longer than any French army had previously attempted, Bonaparte's government offered a cash prize, in the war's middle years, to anyone who could devise a reliable method of preserving food over long periods without spoiling, a prize eventually claimed by a Parisian confectioner named Nicolas Appert, who discovered that food sealed in airtight glass jars and then heated would keep for months, a process refined soon afterward by British inventors building on the same principle, into the sealed tin can, so that the ordinary tin of soup or vegetable sitting in a kitchen cupboard tonight, wherever you happen to be listening to this, descends in a fairly direct line from a problem Bonaparte's quartermasters were trying to solve 2 centuries ago. On the battlefield itself, Bonaparte's own chief surgeon, Dominique Jean Larrey, horrified by the number of wounded men who bled to death on the field, simply waiting for a chance to be carried to a distant hospital after a battle had ended, devised a system of light, horse-drawn ambulances volantes, flying ambulances, designed to move in close behind the fighting itself and evacuate the wounded within minutes rather than hours, along with a system for sorting the wounded by the urgency of their injuries rather than by their rank. An early and genuinely humane form of what modern medicine still calls triage, innovations that saved an incalculable number of lives across the campaigns of this era, and that laid real, direct groundwork for the emergency medical systems that exist in every country in the world today. Even the elaborate chain of semaphore towers that carried messages across France and its client territories, at a speed no rider on horseback could match, relaying signals from tower to tower across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours, stands as a distant mechanical ancestor of the telegraph networks, and in a real, if more roundabout sense, of the instant, borderless communication that carries this very story to you tonight. It is worth naming these smaller inheritances alongside the grander ones, the legal codes and the metric system and the redrawn borders, because they remind us that even the most catastrophic and costly episodes of human history tend to leave behind, scattered amid the wreckage, small practical improvements to ordinary life that far outlast the ambitions that originally produced them, saved from the wreckage the way small hardy plants take root, unnoticed in the aftermath of an avalanche. It is worth, too, gently correcting a piece of popular folklore that has attached itself to Napoleon Bonaparte, with a persistence that has outlasted nearly everything else about him in ordinary conversation, the widespread modern belief that he was unusually short in stature, a belief so entrenched that the term Napoleon complex has entered the English language as a byword for the aggressive overcompensation supposedly practiced by small men. It is almost certainly not true, or at least not true in the way the phrase suggests. by the most careful modern reconstructions cross-referencing the measurements taken at his autopsy, recorded in French feet and inches, against the actual French measurement system of the period rather than the British inches the figure was later, mistakenly converted into, Bonaparte stood somewhere in the region of 5 feet 6 or 7 inches, entirely average, and by some reckonings very slightly above average, for a Frenchman of his generation, a height that seemed short chiefly because he was, for much of his career, surrounded by his own towering hand-picked imperial guard, and because British satirical cartoonists of the era delighted to find any available way to diminish a man they otherwise found genuinely alarming, seized on the exaggerated image of a small, strutting, tyrannical figure and drew it so relentlessly for so many years that the caricature simply outlasted the more mundane truth in the popular imagination, and has never entirely let go of it since. It is a small correction in the scheme of everything else this night has covered, but it is worth making precisely because it illustrates in miniature exactly the kind of process by which legend quietly replaces fact across 2 centuries of retelling, the very same process, at a much larger scale, that produced both the romantic, tragic hero of the Memorial of St. Helena and the bloodthirsty, diminutive tyrant of British wartime cartoons, 2 equally simplified portraits of a man who was, in the honest and complicated reality this whole night has tried to hold on to neither. Coffee, sugar, and the crack in every wall. It is worth returning one last time to the continental system, that grand and ultimately ruinous scheme of economic warfare Bonaparte announced from occupied Berlin in 1806, because it offers, in its slow, grinding, unglamorous failure, one of the clearest windows this whole story has to offer into why even an emperor who could command 600,000 men to march wherever he pointed could not, in the end, command the ordinary economic behaviour of ordinary people. Picture for a moment a merchant in the German port city of Hamburg in the year 1810, a man who has spent 20 years building a modest fortune importing coffee and sugar and tobacco from the Caribbean and reselling it across northern Germany, goods that reach him, as they reach nearly every port on the European mainland by that point in the war, indirectly, through a long, quietly tolerated chain of neutral shippers and forged papers and bribed customs officers that everyone from the humblest dock worker to the region's own French-appointed administrators has, by unspoken and universal agreement, learned to look past. The continental system tells this merchant by imperial decree that he may buy and sell no goods that have touched a British ship or a British port, on pain of confiscation and ruin, but his customers still want their coffee in the morning and their sugar in their tea, exactly as they always have, and are willing to pay handsomely for both, and the fishermen and small boat captains along the coast, whose own livelihoods depend on exactly the coastal trade the decree forbids, are willing, for a fee, to bring the goods in under cover of darkness regardless of what any decree issued from Paris happens to say about it. Multiply that one merchant and that one stretch of coastline by every port and every smuggler and every quietly complicit official across the entire circumference of a continent, Bonaparte's decree claimed to seal from the Bay of Biscay to the Baltic to the furthest Adriatic inlet, and you begin to see why a blockade that looked, on the map in Paris, like an unbroken wall around the whole of Europe was, in the actual daily texture of ordinary economic life, a wall riddled with so many quiet, tolerated cracks that British goods continued reaching the European mainland throughout nearly the entire span of the continental system's existence, smuggled through neutral Baltic and Mediterranean ports, with a persistence that no number of customs inspectors or confiscation decrees ever managed to fully choke off. It is worth naming, honestly, what this actually meant for the grand strategic vision behind the whole scheme, because it is one of the quieter but more instructive failures of this entire story. An emperor who could reorganize the legal code of an entire nation, who could raise and equip armies of hundreds of thousands of men on a schedule of his own choosing, who could redraw the borders of kingdoms with a stroke of a treaty's pen, discovered that he could not, in the end, override the simple, patient, endlessly resourceful determination of ordinary merchants and fishermen and smugglers to keep trading in the goods their neighbours wanted to buy, and that this failure, unglamorous and largely bloodless as it was compared to the battles this whole night has spent so much of its time on, did as much lasting damage to his empire's cohesion as any single lost campaign, because the endless, grinding effort required to enforce an unenforceable blockade dragged France into fresh occupations, fresh garrisons and fresh resentments in Portugal and Spain, and eventually in Russia itself, whose own quiet reopening of its ports to neutral shipping in defiance of the system was, as we heard earlier tonight, among the very sparks that lit the fuse of the invasion that broke the Grande Armée for good. The lesson sitting inside that failure is a simple one, and it is worth carrying forward from this whole long story more than almost any single battle's tactical detail, that the ordinary, cumulative, economic choices of millions of people going about their unremarkable daily business, buying their coffee, selling their sugar, feeding their families however the law technically permits or forbids, possess a kind of patient decentralized power that even the most extraordinary concentration of military force in a single man's hands has never quite managed to fully command then or since. A hero to some, a nightmare to others. It is worth noticing finally, before we let this whole long story settle into its close, how differently this single man is still remembered across the different nations his armies once marched through, because that difference in memory is itself a kind of honest, living record of the difference in what his empire actually meant to the people living under it. In France, he remains, for a very large share of the population, a figure of genuine and largely unashamed national pride, the subject of a booming publishing industry that produces new biographies and battle histories every year. His tomb beneath the Invalides still one of the most visited sites in Paris, his image still used, without much apparent embarrassment, to sell everything from brandy to chocolate, a legacy tended in no small part by the very legend he composed for himself in those final years at Longwood. In Russia, by sharp contrast, the invasion of 1812 is remembered and taught to this day as the Patriotic War, a title that places the emphasis squarely where Russian national memory has always placed it, not on any French general's tactical brilliance, but on the suffering and the eventual triumph of an entire nation that burned its own ancient capital rather than surrender it, a memory so central to Russian national identity that it would be consciously invoked, echoed almost word for word more than a century later, when a different invading army crossed into Russia from the west, and was met with a different, even more catastrophic winter. In Spain, the memory settles differently again, around the guerrilla resistance and the horror Goya recorded, a national memory of invasion and popular resistance rather than of any French glory. In Germany, the story sits inside the larger, more ambivalent memory of the nationalist awakening. The wars of liberation helped produce gratitude for an eventual victory tangled together with the resentment of years of occupation that made that victory necessary in the first place. And in Poland, where you will still find streets and monuments honouring Napoleon Bonaparte in a country that gained, from his brief and always incomplete patronage, its first real taste of restored statehood in over a decade, the memory is warmer than in almost any nation he actually conquered, a fondness earned less by anything he reliably delivered than by the genuine hope he was, for a few years, willing to represent. No single one of these national memories is simply wrong, and no single one of them is the whole truth either, and it is worth letting all of them stand together, unresolved, exactly the way this whole night has tried to let the man himself stand. Neither the flattering hero of his own dictated memoirs, nor the simple, monstrous tyrant of his enemies' cartoons, but a single, extraordinarily consequential human being whose actions meant something different, and often something starkly opposed, depending entirely on which side of his army's advance you happen to be standing on, the mountain and the stone. There is an image worth carrying with you now, all the way back to the very beginning of this long story, because it captures, better than any single battle or treaty could, the particular shape of how this entire extraordinary rise and fall actually happened, and it is the image of an avalanche, the kind that begins on some high, quiet mountainside, with nothing more dramatic than a single loose stone shifting under its own small weight, a stone that dislodges a slightly larger stone beside it, which in turn disturbs a patch of looser snow, which gathers more snow as it moves, faster now, pulling loose rock and packed ice into its widening path, until what began as one small, almost unremarkable displacement has become an unstoppable, roaring mass that reshapes the whole face of the mountain beneath it, and that comes to rest, at last, far below, spent, scattered and silent, having changed the landscape permanently on its way down. Think back for a moment to the gunner at Toulon in 1793, adjusting artillery on a muddy hillside above a besieged harbour, one competent young officer among thousands in a revolutionary army desperate enough for talent that a single well-executed siege could catapult an obscure captain to general's rank within weeks. That was the loose stone, the first small shift that need not, by any law of history, have led anywhere at all, and very nearly did not. Given how close his career came to ending in obscurity or in a prison cell in the years immediately following. Think of the whiff of grape shot in the Paris streets 2 years later, of the ragged, unpaid army of Italy handed to a general nobody yet respected, of the fleet destroyed at the Nile and the army abandoned in Egypt, of the near failure in the garden at Saint-Cloud, rescued only by a quick-witted younger brother, each of these a moment when the gathering mass could plausibly have stopped. Could have been just one more competent general's career rather than the beginning of an empire, and did not stop because at each of these junctures, chance and ambition and genuine, extraordinary ability arrived together in exactly the combination the moment required, and the avalanche kept gathering. And think too of how the same avalanche came down in the end, because empires assembled by exactly this kind of gathering, unplanned momentum rarely stopped by any single dramatic decision either. They come apart the way they came together, piece by piece, each failure loosening the next. The Spanish ulcer bled the empire's resources for 6 years before a single Russian snowflake ever fell on a retreating French column. The humiliation of Prussia in 1806 planted the seeds of the very military reforms that would help break Bonaparte's own army at Leipzig 7 years later. The nationalism his own armies had carried into Germany and Italy as a byproduct of conquest, never as its intended purpose, curdled within a decade into the ideological fuel of the coalition that finally brought him down. Even the personal choices, the divorce of Josephine in pursuit of an heir, the marriage to an Austrian archduchess meant to secure a lasting peace with the House of Habsburg, fed into the same widening, self-reinforcing collapse, because the Austrian marriage brought only a few years of uneasy peace before Austria, too, rejoined the coalition against him regardless. It is worth resisting, even now, the temptation to describe any of this as inevitable, because it plainly was not. A single, well-aimed bullet at Toulon, a slightly different vote in the shouting chamber at Saint-Cloud, a Russian Tsar willing to negotiate peace from a burning Moscow, a few hours earlier start to the fighting at Waterloo before the Prussians could arrive. Any one of a dozen small contingent turns could have sent this entire enormous story down some entirely different mountainside. But it is also worth naming honestly the pattern that repeats across every single one of these turns, which is that once a great mass of ambition and momentum and human suffering begins moving at a certain scale, it develops a logic and a velocity almost entirely independent of any single person's continued control over it, even the control of the singularly forceful, singularly capable man who first set the stone moving, and that this, more than any other single explanation, is how a Corsican lawyer's son born on a carpet embroidered with the heroes of an ancient war became, for a little over a decade, very nearly the master of an entire continent, and how in the end that same continent, slowly and at terrible cost, gathered itself back up the mountainside to bury him. What it actually felt like. Before we walk back over the whole shape of this story one final time, it is worth pausing to reconstruct, as far as the surviving letters and memoirs allow us to reconstruct it, what the inside of all this actually felt like to the men who lived it minute by minute. Because the sweeping language of campaigns and coalitions that this kind of history is so often told in has a way of floating a listener several miles above the actual physical, sensory experience of the era, and it is worth coming back down to ground level, gently, before we close. Picture the ordinary texture of a soldier's day on campaign, not the battle itself, but the vastly larger portion of his war spent simply marching. The weight of a knapsack and cartridge box settling into raw shoulders within the first hour of a dawn departure. The particular ache of wet wool trousers that never fully dried between one river crossing and the next. The smell of a bivouac at night. Wood smoke and boiled meat when there was meat to be had, and only wood smoke and damp earth when there was not. Thousands of men and horses packed into a single field. The low murmur of conversation in half a dozen languages drifting between campfires. A soldier's letter home written by firelight on a knee, the ink smudging in the humid air, describing a sunset over a Spanish hillside in the same breath as a complaint about lice. Picture, too, the sound of a battle itself, because it was nothing like the tidy, orderly geometry of the maps this whole night has asked you to imagine. The maps with their clean arrows showing this corps advancing here and that cavalry wheeling there. It was, by every soldier's account that survives, an assault on every sense at once. The concussive, chest-rattling roar of massed artillery, so loud and so continuous across a battle's peak hours that veterans described a kind of temporary ringing deafness that lasted for days afterward. The thick, sulphurous smell of black powder smoke drifting low across a field until visibility shrank to a few dozen yards, and a man could no longer tell, from the smoke and the noise alone, whether the army beside him was winning or dying. The screams of wounded horses, which several soldiers who left written accounts specifically singled out, across very different battles and very different decades of this long war, as the single most unbearable sound of the entire experience, worse, several of them insisted, than the cries of wounded men. And picture the aftermath, the part the paintings almost never show. A field the morning after Borodino or Wagram or Waterloo, tens of thousands of bodies, men and horses together, scattered across ground, still smoking in places from the previous day's fires. The low, terrible sound of the wounded who had survived the night calling out for water or for their mothers in half a dozen languages, and the burial parties, exhausted soldiers themselves, digging the vast shallow pits into which the dead of these battles were, of grim practical necessity, deposited together, often stripped first of anything of value by their own former comrades, or by the local peasants who followed every army's battles the way gulls follow a plough, a detail that sits uncomfortably beside the glory of the bulletins but belongs, honestly, in any full account of what these victories actually looked and sounded and smelled like up close. It is worth holding this sensory reality in your mind for just a moment longer, because it is the ground truth beneath every fragment headline and every phrase like decisive victory that this whole night has used to move the story along at the pace a single night's listening requires, and because it is, in the end, the reality every one of those battles actually was, for every one of the hundreds of thousands of individual men who marched into them, whatever grand strategic sentence a historian 2 centuries later eventually reduces the whole day down to: walking the whole road again. If your eyes are growing heavy now, and I hope they are, it might help to walk back over the shape of this whole long night, one more time, slowly, the way you might retrace a path you have just finished walking, checking that you remember where each turn led. We began on a sofa embroidered with the heroes of the Iliad, in a house on a steep street in Ajaccio, with a poor and proud family whose noble title meant, in practical terms, almost nothing at all, and with a boy who left that island at 9 years old, mocked at school for his accent and his empty pockets, and who found, in the shattering of the old French monarchy and the desperate meritocratic hunger of a revolutionary army starved of experienced officers, a door that would have stayed firmly closed to a poor Corsican cadet in almost any other decade of European history. We watched that door open at Toulon, in the mud and the fire above a besieged harbour, and watched it very nearly close again in an unemployed general's idle winter in Paris, before a royalist mob in the city's own streets handed him, quite by accident, the chance to prove himself indispensable with a whiff of grape shot. We followed him into Italy, 26 years old and commanding an army nobody respected, and watched him teach an entire continent's worth of professional soldiers at Lodi and Arcola and Rivoli a faster, hungrier, more ruthless kind of war than they had ever prepared to fight. We followed him to Egypt, beneath the pyramids, and beneath the ruins of a fleet Admiral Nelson burned in a single night at Aboukir Bay, and watched him abandon an army of 30,000 men to its own devices, rather than abandon his own rising ambition. We watched the 18th of Brumaire nearly collapse in a shouting match in a garden palace, saved in its final hour not by the general everyone remembers, but by a quick-thinking younger brother, and watched the first consul that emerged from that near-failure build with genuine and lasting skill, a Bank of France, a national school system, a reconciliation with the Church, and above all a single unified code of civil law that, whatever its very real blind spots toward women and toward the enslaved, still shapes the daily legal lives of a large fraction of the human beings alive on earth at this very moment. We watched him take a crown into his own two hands, rather than accept it from a pope's, and then watch the wars begin in earnest. The deception at Austerlitz, so complete and so elegant that Bonaparte himself called it, from the bitterness of his final exile, the finest battle of his life. The annihilation of Prussia's army in a single autumn day at Jena and Austerlitz. The horror of Eylau's blizzard, and the theatre of the raft at Tilsit. The continental system that could strangle no economy quite as completely as its architect had hoped, because ordinary people's need to trade kept finding, and would always keep finding, some crack in even the most carefully sealed blockade. We watched the empire reach its dazzling, overextended height. Brothers and a sister's husband installed on thrones from Naples to Holland to Westphalia, the Napoleonic Code spreading with the armies that enforced it, and we watched too the two wounds that would not heal, the Spanish ulcer, a war against an entire armed population that no decisive battle could ever end, and the Russian campaign, 600,000 men marched into a vastness that Bonaparte's whole method of war, built for the dense, rich farmland of Western Europe, was never designed to survive. We felt the cold at the Berezina and the silence of a burned Moscow that would not answer a single peace overture, and we counted, as honestly as the surviving record allows us to count, the staggering and still only approximately known price of that single catastrophic winter. We watched Germany rise at Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, and watched an emperor who had spent 2 decades fighting other people's wars on other people's soil retreat, for the first time across his own border, into the campaign of France, brilliant and hopeless at once, ending in an abdication, and a failed attempt at poison, and an extraordinary, almost unbelievable sentence of exile to a small island, a comfortable sail from the very coast he had just been forced to leave. And we watched him come back, because the door his enemies left open at the Congress of Vienna, distracted by their own quarrels over Poland and Saxony, even as they congratulated themselves on his downfall, and the resentment simmering in a French army whose loyalty a fumbling restored monarchy had managed to squander within a single year, together made the impossible, for 100 astonishing days, possible again. A coat thrown open before a firing squad at Laffrey, a kingdom recovered, without a single shot fired along the entire road to Paris, and then at Waterloo on a low ridge south of Brussels, the whole extraordinary story brought to its final, decisive close by a defensive line that held, a diversion at a farmhouse called Hougoumont that drew away troops that were never available where they were needed most, a Prussian army that arrived exactly as its commander had promised it would, and an imperial guard that broke, for the first and only time in its history, sending the Cri la Garde recul rippling through an army that had never, in all its years of victory, needed to imagine what its own defeat might sound like. And we followed him, at the very last, to a damp house on a wind-scoured rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, where the last great campaign he ever fought was not for territory at all, but for the story that would be told about him afterward, a campaign he waged with a pen and a devoted listener rather than an army, and that he won, in its way, as completely and as durably as he had once won Austerlitz, because 2 centuries later, we are still, this very night, telling the story very largely on the terms he set for it from that small damp room at Longwood. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, it is worth asking gently before we let this whole long story go, what a night like this one, spent in the company of armies and emperors and battles whose names have echoed for 2 centuries, is actually for, because it is not, in the end, only for the facts themselves, useful and carefully checked as we have tried to keep them. It is for the particular quiet perspective that a story of this size can offer a single person, lying in a single bed, in a single room, at whatever hour of the night it happens to be where you are right now. Somewhere in the story we have just walked through together, an emperor who commanded, for a little over a decade, the fate of most of a continent, who could summon 600,000 men to march wherever he pointed, who could crown his own brothers kings with a stroke of a pen, discovered, in the end, that he could not command a Spanish village to stop resisting him, could not command a Russian winter to arrive a few weeks later than it did, could not command a single loose bridge at the Berezina to hold, could not, in the last analysis, command very much at all beyond the narrow, temporary and ultimately illusory power that circumstance and his own extraordinary will had lent him for a season. Whatever is pressing on you tonight, whatever worry followed you into this bed and is still, perhaps, sitting somewhere at the edge of your thoughts even as my voice grows quieter, it is very probably smaller than an empire, and if an empire that commanded the wealth and the armies of a continent could not, in the end, hold itself together against the ordinary, patient, cumulative weight of chance and consequence, and other people's stubborn refusal to be conquered, then whatever is on your own mind tonight is allowed, for these last few minutes, to loosen its grip a little too. That brings us to the end of our story. It is worth remembering, one last time before we close, how much of what actually happened to Napoleon Bonaparte, and to the tens of millions of people whose lives his ambitions touched, was decided not by some single, dramatic, unrepeatable stroke of genius or villainy, but by the same kind of small, human, often unglamorous forces that shape almost every life, the accident of which door happens to be open when a particular door needs to be open, the quiet arithmetic of supply and distance and disease that no battlefield brilliance can ever fully overcome, the slow, cumulative resentment of ordinary people who simply refuse in their scattered, uncoordinated millions to accept that they have already lost. He was, by turns and sometimes all at once, a genuine reformer and a ruthless opportunist, a liberator of some peoples and an oppressor of others, a devoted husband and a coldly calculating dynast, a man who could weep at the loss of a marshal he loved and order the massacre of thousands of surrendered prisoners in the very same year. 2 centuries on, historians still argue, with real passion and real evidence on more than one side of the argument, over whether the world he left behind was, on balance, better or worse, for the passage of his extraordinary and terrible career through it, and it is testament to the sheer unmanageable size of what he actually did that no single answer to that question has ever managed to satisfy everyone, or perhaps deserves to. Thank you, as always, for spending this long night with me, and with Napoleon Bonaparte, and with the millions of people whose names never made it into a single bulletin, but whose lives, and whose deaths are as much a part of this story as any battle this whole night has named. If you found your way into this story tonight and it kept you company through some of the dark, I hope you will consider liking this video and subscribing, only, as always, if you genuinely enjoyed it, and leaving your location and your local time in the comments below, so that this small, scattered community of night owls and insomniacs and quietly curious minds can keep finding one another across all the time zones this story has now, in one way or another, touched. Let your body sink a little further into the mattress now. Let the weight of everything we have carried together tonight, the crowns and the campaigns, the frozen rivers and the burned cities, the small boy on the embroidered sofa and the old man on the wind-scoured rock, settle gently into the quiet dark around you. No heavier now than a story someone once told you to help you fall asleep. Close your eyes. Good night and sweet dreams.